Roan opened his eyes before dawn and stared for a long time at the crack in the ceiling of a stranger's house, a house that was now his home. The body was thin and light. It was the body of a 15-year-old. Roan had been living in it for 3 weeks now, and he still woke up feeling as if his boots were too small. Today was the day of awakening in the village of Westbrook. Once a year, the altar stone in the square bestowed a profession upon the teenagers, and their entire lives depended on that profession. Roan got up and washed his face with ice-cold water from the barrel. His hands instinctively checked to see if the barrel had sprung a leak at the bottom hoop. He caught himself making that movement and smiled. Some habits outlive their owners. The entire village had already gathered in the square. 80 households, 300 people. Village head Hubbard stood by the altar stone in his only clean shirt and called out names. His son, Digran, was the first to step up to the stone. The stone flashed blue. An inscription appeared above Digran's head. Second star, Spearman. The crowd roared with delight. The blue light signified talent worthy of the city guard. Hubert swelled with pride and announced that in the fall he would take his son to the city of Tollbrook to serve the Baron. Next came the miller's daughter, Lissa. The stone gave a green light and the profession of first star herbalist. That was good too. Any war provides work for herbalists. Then came the rest, a woodcutter, a fisherman, a militiaman. The stone's light dimmed with each name. Finally, Hubert uttered Roan's name, and he said it as if he were spitting out a pit. Everyone in the village knew the story of this orphan. His parents had died of swamp fever. His grandfather had died the previous winter, leaving his grandson an abandoned plot of land by the thorn-covered wasteland. And a month ago, the boy had fallen off a cliff by the river and lain unconscious for 3 days. He woke up alive, but strange. He spoke slowly. He looked intently. Roan placed his palm on the altar stone. The stone responded with light. The light was gray. It was the first time the crowd had ever seen the color gray, and for a second, the square fell silent. An inscription appeared above Roan's head. Farmer, no star, no rank, just a farmer. The silence burst into laughter. Someone shouted that the stone had handed down a verdict on the guy. Someone else added that on Westbrook's lands even weeds struggle to grow, and a farmer here was about as useful as a saddle on a fish. Digran laughed the loudest of all and advised Roan to take up begging as well, so he'd have something to do in the winter. Roan remained silent. He stared at the gray inscription and felt the skin beneath his collarbone grow warm. The warmth gathered into a single point. The point burned him briefly and intensely. No one around him noticed. Hubert waved his hand and declared the ceremony over. As he walked away, he called out to Roan that no one had canceled the village tax and that 40 copper coins were due from his dead grandfather's plot for the harvest festival. Roan nodded and walked away amid laughter and whistles. The walk to the plot took half an hour. The plot lay off the beaten path between a thorn-covered wasteland and an old ravine, a crooked house, a roofless barn, 12 acres of land as gray as ash. His grandfather had tried to grow barley here for 20 years, and for 20 years the land had yielded half of what it took. Roan entered the house, closed the door, and only then pulled up his shirt. Beneath his collarbone, a mark darkened on his skin. A circle of wheat ears and animal tracks. The mark stirred. Before Roan's eyes, lines unfolded, visible only to him. The shepherd's brand has been awakened. The legacy is lost. The bearer has been identified. The essence of the gift, every creature raised by the bearer's hands, from the earliest stage to maturity, bestows upon the bearer a share of its natural qualities. The share depends on the creature's stage of development and the labor invested. These qualities are cumulative. No limit has been detected. Roan reread the lines 4 times. Then he sat down on a bench because his legs had gone weak. Not the power of slain monsters, not stolen skills, the qualities of the creatures he had raised. A swift creature will impart speed. A strong one will impart strength. A poisonous creature will grant resistance to poison. And if you raise something truly great, there is no limit. The brand twitched again. The first milestone was set. Raked the first creature to the mature stage in 20 days. The reward, a share of its qualities and the unlocking of the land's properties. Failure, The brand would lie dormant for a full year. Roan stood up. 20 days. He had no coins for livestock, no grain for feed, not a single intact fence. But he had hands that remembered how to work. He went out into the yard and began his rounds. He inspected the well. There was water, but it smelled of clay. He inspected the barn. The walls stood firm. The roof could be patched with thorns and turf in 2 days. He surveyed the soil. He rubbed a gray clump between his fingers, sniffed it, and even touched it with his tongue. Sour, dead from acidity, not from a curse. The thought came to him of its own accord, calm and practical. He'd worked this kind of soil before. True, back then he'd had lime and manure and an entire farm under his command. Roan pushed the thought aside. The past would come in handy when he got around to it. Right now, he needed a living creature. He took his grandfather's axe and walked along the ravine to check the old trapping pits. His grandfather had dug them for badgers. The first 2 pits were empty. In the third, Roan heard a commotion. 3 steppe hares were huddled at the bottom of the pit, not the usual gray ones, but large ones with reddish markings. It was a breed known locally as heather hares, considered inedible because of their bitter meat. 2 of the rabbits were unharmed. The third was dragging its hind leg. Roan climbed down into the pit, slowly. The rabbits huddled in a corner. He didn't reach out to them. He crouched down and froze. His breathing was steady. His gaze was turned away. An animal trusts not words, but body language. This knowledge surfaced in him as naturally as the ability to breathe. He used to sit like this for hours in pens with terrified young rabbits. After 15 minutes, the rabbit stopped trembling. Roan took off his jacket, covered all 3 with a single motion, and carried them upstairs. At home, he felt the lame one's paw, dislocation, not a fracture. He clamped the little creature between his knees, took the paw between 2 fingers, and gave it a sharp tug. The joint snapped back into place with a quiet click. The rabbit squealed and fell silent at once. Roan bandaged the paw with a strip from an old shirt and thought that his body remembered this movement better than he remembered faces. The brand beneath his collarbone grew warm. 3 low-tier creatures had been taken into his care. Species, heather rabbit. Breed rating, sleeping blood. Roan didn't understand what sleeping blood meant, but there was no time to figure it out. 20 days began, which he later recalled as a single, long day. He repaired the barn roof by moonlight. He cut sod from the wasteland and hauled it on his back until his shoulders could no longer straighten. He found an outcrop of white limestone in a ravine, chipped it with the back of an axe, and scattered the crumbs over the garden bed behind the barn because lime heals acidic soil, not prayer. He dug up the garden bed, mixed ash from the stove with silt from the river, and sowed clover from a handful of seeds he'd found in his grandfather's chest. On foreign soil, clover sprouts in 2 weeks. In his garden bed, the clover sprouted on the 4th day, so thick that Roan sat down beside it and simply stared for a minute. The earth beneath the brand breathed differently. The rabbits ate the clover and changed before his eyes. By the 10th day, they had grown to the size of a house cat. By the 15th day, the lame one had stopped limping and became the fastest of the 3. Roan fed them from his palm every morning and every evening. The brand counted more than just days. The brand counted touches. On the 19th day, lines flashed before Roan's eyes. The 3 creatures had reached maturity. Milestone completed. Share calculated. The bearer's physical agility increased by 6 parts. Acuity of hearing increased by 3 parts. The property of the earth revealed the living boundary. Everything that grows and feeds within the boundaries of the plot matures faster and becomes stronger than usual. Roan stood in the middle of the yard and listened to a mouse scurrying about beyond the ravine. He could hear the mouse 40 paces away. He tossed a log and caught it behind his back without looking. His body reacted before his mind could think. He laughed out loud for the first time in both of his lives. The test came the next day, and it came on its own. Roan was carrying water from the well when the blackthorn bushes crackled from the direction of the wasteland. A teenage wild boar burst into the yard, driven by horseflies, furious and blinded by pain. The boar charged straight at Roan. The old Roan would have had just enough time to fall. The new Roan stepped aside at the very last moment, spun on his heel, and lashed the boar across the snout with the rocker arm. The boar yelped, spun around, and ran back into the thorn bush. The whole scene took 3 heartbeats, and by the crooked fence stood the hunter Garth, holding a spool of repair wire in his hands. Garth had been walking this trail to his snares for 20 years. Garth was the very man who in the town square had spoken louder than anyone else that a gray light was a death sentence. Now Garth stood there looking at Roan as if he'd just seen a horse speak. He asked slowly where the boy had learned to move like that. Roan shrugged and replied that there was a lot of work on the farm, and it all had to be done quickly. Garth shifted his gaze to the rabbits by the barn. The mature rabbits sat in a row, each the size of a good-sized hare, and eyed the hunter warily. Garth swallowed. He said that heath rabbits don't grow that big even in 3 years. Then he walked away without saying goodbye, glancing back twice. Roan watched him go and realized one simple thing. Garth would keep quiet for a week, maybe 2. Then, over a mug at the tavern, he'd let his tongue loose. Rumors of the strange farm would spread through the village, and the road from the village led to only one place, the town of Tolbrook, where Baron Craigmore sat collecting taxes even from dead land. Living land would cost even more. Roan went back to work, but until evening, something weighed heavily between his shoulder blades. That night, he realized exactly what it was. He was awakened by the sound of rabbits in the barn tapping their paws on the floor, an alarm. Roan went out into the yard with an axe. His keen hearing, a gift from the rabbits, picked up soft footsteps in the darkness by the ravine. The footsteps weren't human. A beast was circling the edge of the ravine, sizing him up. Large, cautious, patient.
Against the backdrop of the stars, Roan made out the tufts on its ears and realized that a wilderness lynx had been drawn by the scent of his ravaged rabbits. A second-tier predator that even experienced hunters wouldn't take on alone. The lynx crouched at the edge of the ravine and waited for the lights in the house to go out.
Roan awakened his despised profession as a farmer and the secret mark of the shepherd, which grants him the qualities of the creatures he raises. In 20 days, he raised 3 heather rabbits to the mature stage, gaining 6 points of agility, 3 points of hearing, and the living boundary trait, which accelerates the growth of everything on his plot. The hunter Garth saw his new abilities and the enormous rabbits, and that night, a second-tier wasteland lynx came to the farm. Roan stood in the yard with an axe, weighing his options. Running to the village for help meant abandoning the rabbits, and with them, half his strength. Fighting a second-tier lynx head-on meant certain death. That left a third option that would never have occurred to either a warrior or a mage. The path of a man who had spent half his life dealing with beasts. The predator by the ravine was patient, but a beast's patience is always a balancing act between hunger and fear. Roan returned to the house, lit a lamp, and pointedly placed it by the window. Let the lynx see that the man is awake. Then he brought out his grandfather's old badger net from the shed and, until dawn, knitted it with double thread, reinforcing the mesh. His hands tied the knots of their own accord. His mind recalled that a predator lying in ambush always strikes from the same spot if that spot has proven effective. The lynx had chosen the edge of the ravine. That meant he had to catch it at the edge of the ravine. In the morning, Roan did something that would have made any peasant's hair stand on end. He took the slowest of the 3 rabbits and tied it to a long cord 20 paces from the ravine. The rabbit was bait, but live, moving bait. Roan stretched the net between 2 stakes along the edge, covered it with leaves, and ran the cord from the net behind his woodpile. Then the waiting began. The lynx came on the second night. Roan heard it 60 paces away. The hearing of mature rabbits was better than any sentries. The beast slipped down from the edge of the ravine as a gray shadow and headed for the decoy along the very same path it had taken all the previous nights. The rabbit began to thrash about on the cord. The lynx picked up speed and leapt. Roan yanked the cord. The net shot up like a slanted sail and engulfed the predator in midair. From then on, everything came down to split-second decisions. The lynx was tearing at the net with its claws and had already pushed its front paw through. Roan darted out from behind the woodpile faster than he'd expected. The agility of the 6 parts carried him like the wind. He threw a second net over the tangled web and the beast, then threw his full weight onto it and pressed the lynx's head to the ground with the shovel handle. The beast screamed and thrashed. Roan held on. He held on and spoke. His voice was low and steady, without malice. The words meant nothing. It was the tone that mattered. After 100 heartbeats, the lynx stopped tearing at the net and began to breathe rapidly and shallowly. Fear had overcome its fury, and then Roan saw what he hadn't been able to make out in the darkness before. The lynx's left flank was scarred by 3 old, ragged gashes. The wounds were festering. The animal had been wounded long ago and severely. That was why the lynx had been circling the farm for a week instead of hunting in the wasteland. It couldn't catch prey any faster than a well-fed rabbit. The brand beneath its collarbone grew warm and displayed lines that made Roan freeze. A second-stage creature detected in a state of decline. Fostering is possible. Condition: the creature must accept food from the carrier's hands voluntarily. If successful, the creature will be counted among the raised ones. Warning: an adult creature yields a portion of its qualities only in exchange for advancing a tier. Roan sat on a tied-up lynx in the middle of the courtyard at night and laughed silently. The mark was offering him the chance to make a wilderness lynx his pet, a creature that the hunters of Westbrook cursed whenever its name was mentioned. He dragged the bound beast into the barn and placed it in a fenced-off corner. The rabbits huddled on the top shelf and didn't come down from there for a week. Then began the days that Roan would later describe as walking a tightrope, if there had been anyone to tell. He cleaned the lynx's wounds while it was immobilized by the net. He washed away the pus with a decoction of thornbark. His body remembered that a festering wound on an animal should not be sewn up, but kept open and clean. Then he fed the lynx. More precisely, he placed meat on a long shovel and stepped back. For 3 days, the lynx wouldn't eat in his presence. On the 4th day, she ate a rabbit and a vole without taking her eyes off Roan. On the 7th day, she took the meat from a shovel that had been cut in half. On the 12th, she took it from his palm. The brand flared up so intensely that Roan was jolted. A second-stage creature has been voluntarily taken under guardianship. No name has been assigned by the bearer. Roan named her Zola for the color of her fur and because she had nearly been burned to death. While Zola was recovering, life on the farm went on as usual, though that usual was becoming less and less like the norm. The clover in the garden had to be mowed twice a week. A pair of rabbits produced their first litter of 8 kits, and the living boundary spurred the young one's growth so that within a month, the 8 were indistinguishable from their parents. Roan expanded the pen, then he expanded it again. He kept a thick notebook on the boundary made of wrapping paper he'd traded for with the miller and kept records in it just as he'd once kept records on a farm with 1,000 head of livestock. Weight gain, feeding days, litters. The numbers soothed him better than sleep. By the end of the month, the brand had tallied the results. 11 creatures of the lower tier had been brought to maturity. Agility had increased by a total of 19 units. Acuity of hearing had increased to 11 units. Strength of tendons had increased to 5 units. Roan could now run up the sheer ladder to the hayloft without touching the rungs with his hands. He caught a jug that had fallen from its hook by the elbow before it hit the floor. He heard Garth checking the snares down by the ravine and heard what Garth was muttering under his breath. And Garth was muttering that something unprecedented was happening on that damned plot of land and that he wouldn't keep quiet about it any longer. And Garth didn't keep quiet. Over a mug of beer at the tavern, he told everyone about rabbits the size of dogs. No one believed him, and they laughed at him. Then, out of spite, Garth made a bet for a silver coin, and the next morning he brought village elder Hubart and half the village of onlookers to the farm. Roan met them at the fence. He'd managed to herd Zola into the barn, but it was too late to hide the rabbits. The crowd gathered by the fence and fell silent. Beyond the fence, on emerald clover, the likes of which couldn't be found anywhere else within 40 leagues, 11 heather rabbits, each half the size of a sheep, were grazing. Hubert opened his mouth and closed it again. The miller took off his hat for some reason. Lissa, the herbalist, crouched by the boundary, rubbed a clover leaf between her fingers and said quietly that, according to all the laws of herbs, such a leaf could not possibly exist on this land. Digron, standing behind everyone, asked loudly what the farmer fed his animals and whether it was stolen grain. Roan replied that he fed them with the land and his labor, and suggested that Degran earn himself the same rabbits in the same way. The crowd began to snicker at Degran, and this was the first time in its life that the mockery was not directed at Roan. Hubert cleared his throat and spoke in a different voice, a businesslike voice. He said that since the plot had begun to turn a profit, the tax on the plot would be recalculated. Instead of 40 copper coins, 2 live rabbits would be due by the harvest festival. Roan didn't argue. He had expected the worst, and the worst was not long in coming. A week later, a merchant's caravan pulled up to the farm. The caravan's owner, the merchant Fess, was buying up wool and hides from the villages for the town of Tollbrook. During the hour the caravan stopped, someone had whispered to him in the tavern about the marvelous rabbits. Fess walked along the fence for a long time. He eyed the rabbits, the clover, the barn, and Roan himself. Then he made an offer. For a pair of breeding rabbits, he offered more silver than Roan's grandfather had seen in a whole year. Roan sold 1 pair of the young rabbits. A refusal would have alarmed the merchant more than any price. Fess paid up and, already on his way out, remarked, seemingly in jest, that serious people in Tollbrook were interested in such goods, and that it was better to sell to serious people himself than to wait for them to come looking for the goods without being asked. The wagon rolled away. Roan stood by the fence, tossing the silver coins in his palm, and listening to the branding iron warming evenly beneath his collarbone. It was only a matter of time before the serious people from Tollbrook arrived. That meant there was no time to waste. The rabbits had given him agility. That agility would stop neither a spear-wielding guard nor a guild hunter. He needed strength. That same fall, Fess, passing by on his return journey, turned off toward the farm himself and offered his wares. In his wagon, a young bull, bought on a whim in a mountain village, was on its last legs. The breed was called Granite, and was renowned for its power, but the bull was riddled with worms, staggering, and hadn't eaten in 4 days. Fess sold it for a quarter of the price, laughing as he said he was selling the farmer future carrion. Roan felt the calf's belly, looked into its eyes, and checked under its eyelids. A calm certainty welled up inside him. Worm-induced weakness and ruminants is treated with bitter wormwood and a day of fasting, followed by small, frequent feedings. He'd administered this treatment hundreds of times. Roan paid in silence. As he led the calf away on a lead rope, he looked back. Fess was watching him go, the laughter now gone from his face. The merchant's gaze was as sharp as a hook. And behind Fess, perched on the pommel, sat an unfamiliar man in a gray cloak who hadn't spoken a word the entire time they'd been parked and hadn't taken his eyes off Roan even once. Roan had captured a wounded wilderness lynx, nursed her back to health, and she willingly entered the care of the brand, receiving the name Zola. The rabbit population grew to 11 mature individuals, granting Roan 19 points in agility, 11 in hearing, and 5 in constitution. The entire village, led by the village headman, took notice of the farm and raised the tax to 2 rabbits. Merchant Fess bought a couple of rabbits, sold Roan a sick granite bull calf, and warned about the serious people from Tollbrook, while a man in a gray cloak silently watched Roan from his wagon train. Roan put the bull in the far corner of the barn, away from Zola, and began treating him immediately. A day of fasting on plain water, then a decoction of wormwood and buckthorn bark 3 times a day, then crushed feed in small portions every 3 hours, day and night. Roan slept in 2-hour bursts and woke up without an alarm. His body remembered this erratic rhythm. He had once lived like this for weeks on end, raising fallen calves, and back then he had a crew behind him. Now he had only his own hands and the brand. On the 5th day, the calf stood up without trembling. On the 8th, he began butting the feeder, demanding more food. The brand responded with lines of text. First, level creature, taken into custody, species, granite bull, breed assessment, thick-blooded, condition, or recovery. Roan scratched the calf between its future horns and named him Valen. From then on, time on the farm passed in broad strokes. Roan led Valen to the river meadow and mowed grass there for the winter until his shoulders ached. Following advice that surfaced from the past, Roan mixed crushed limestone into the bull's feed to strengthen his bones. Roan converted the barn into 2 stalls and a winter rabbit pen, working at night by lamplight. And the living boundary did its work quietly and fearfully. Valen grew so much that the record book noted a weight gain so great that Roan couldn't believe it himself, and weighed the bull twice on the scales suspended by ropes. By midwinter, the granite calf had become a bull. Its withers were higher than Roan's head. Its chest was as wide as a door. Its stride made the dishes in the house rattle. The brand announced a mature stage on a frosty night, and Roan sensed the change before he had even finished reading the lines. Physical strength increased by 14 points. Strength had increased by 17 parts. Resistance to fatigue by 9 parts. He stepped out into the courtyard, grabbed the corner of an empty water barrel, and lifted it with one hand. The barrel weighed as much as a grown man. Roan held it aloft, listened to his own steady breathing, and set it back in place very carefully. Strength took some getting used to. The first few days he snapped the handles off his tools simply because he forgot to loosen his grip. A chance encounter with the blacksmith Brahm provided the perfect test of his newfound strength. Roan had come to the village to order hinges for a gate. Outside, the smithy stood the miller's wagon with a cracked axle, and Brahm himself was lying beneath it, cursing because the jackbeam had broken and the wagon full of grain wouldn't be unloaded until evening. Roan said he'd hold it up. Brahm climbed out from under the cart, looked at the skinny young man, and laughed into his beard. Brahm was the strongest man in the 40-household village, and in his youth he used to bend horseshoes on a dare. Roan crouched down, grabbed the axle, and lifted the loaded corner of the cart an elbow's length off the ground. Then he stood there, holding it, while the blacksmith replaced the axle. Brahm took twice longer than usual because every 10 heartbeats he'd turn around and look. When the wagon was back on its wheels, Brahm wiped his hands and asked quietly how old the young man was. Roan replied that he was 16. Brahm paused and said he wouldn't take money for the hinges, but he would take the truth. Someday, later, when Roan himself wanted to give it to him. From that day on, the blacksmith greeted Roan with a handshake, and the village began to split in two. Half looked upon the farmer with respect, the other half with envy that festered like an abscess. Degran, from the latter group, said in the tavern that something was amiss, and that the gray light of the stone granted neither strength nor dexterity, which meant the boy had become entangled with something dark. The words were foolish, but clung to people's minds. Roan knew about them and carried on with his work. He understood what the village did not. His neighbor's envy was the least of his problems. A bigger problem had arrived on the last snowfall, pulled by 4 sleds. These people were not barons. Worse. 6 men sat on the sleigh, clad in sturdy sheepskin coats and carrying short swords and crossbows, and the leader presented the village headman with a copper badge from the Tollbrook Free Hunters Guild. Officially, the guild had arrived to buy furs. Unofficially, on the very first evening, the sleds turned toward the thorn-covered wasteland and stopped half a league from Roan's farm. Roan found out about this before anyone else in the village because Zola had been worried since midday. And by dusk, he himself had heard strangers' voices on the wind. His keen hearing made the night as clear as day. Roan herded the rabbits into the barn, locked Valin inside, and sat down to wait with an axe on his lap. They arrived after midnight, group of 4. They moved skillfully downwind, 2 heading for the barn and 2 for the house. Roan heard every step they took from the wasteland itself and had time to think that the trappers had come not to kill, but to take the goods. Live wonder beasts. Someone in Tollbrook had paid for specimens. They pried open the barn door with a crowbar quietly and skillfully, and then the silence ended. In the darkness of the barn, Zola pounced on the intruders. A second-tier wasteland lynx in an enclosed space isn't a beast, it's a millstone with claws. The first hunter was flung out the door back first, his shoulder torn open. The second one screamed inside and kept screaming for a long time. Two men from the house rushed to the rescue, and just then, Roan stepped out into the yard. He wasn't playing the hero.
He did exactly what a shepherd does when faced with wolves. He cut him off. He intercepted the first hunter's sword-wielding arm as it swung and squeezed. Last time, with that same grip, he'd snapped the handles off shovels. There was a crack. The hunter let out a shriek and collapsed. The second one fired his crossbow at almost point-blank range.
Roan's 19-part agility pulled him out of the line of fire even as the weapon was being raised, and the bolt struck the barn wall. It took just 2 breaths to run up to the shooter and strike his helmet flat with the butt of his sword. The yard fell silent. A fourth man crawled out of the barn, clutching his face, and Zola followed, leisurely licking her paw. Roan tied all 4 of them up with their own belts, stacked them by the well, and by dawn had brought the village headman, the blacksmith, and Garth from the village to serve as witnesses. Hubert saw the courtyard filled with the bandaged town hunters, a giant bull in the stall, and a lynx sitting at the farmer's feet like a dog. The village head turned pale and didn't speak until his 3rd attempt. He said that the guild would be held accountable under the law for attacking a barren subject and that he would immediately write to Tollbrook. The senior hunter spat out blood and laughed. He said there was no need to write anywhere because the paper would come on its own. He said they'd been hired to inspect the goods up close and that the client would receive a report either way. Then, looking up at Roan, he added that people like him were called self-made men in the guild's records, and that it was no longer hunters who came from Tollbrook for such men. Roan handed the bound men over to the village head, took the crossbow and 2 swords as compensation for the damage, and returned to the morning milking of the goat he'd bought last fall. His hands went through the familiar motions. His mind was calculating. He had, at best, 2 months until the spring mud season and until the paperwork arrived from the city. The rabbits had given him speed. The boulder had given him strength, but he had nothing to protect him against the poison of a blade or a poisoned arrow, and the people who came for the self-made ones rarely played fair. The answer grazed before his eyes every day, or rather, it flitted by. Back in the fall, Roan had spotted an old, hollow elm in a thorn-covered wasteland deep in the backwoods, with a black cloud buzzing around it. Wild bees, but not just any bees. Garth gave that elm a wide berth and said they were ink bees, whose venom could knock a dog out with 3 stings and a person with 10. Their honey was considered medicinal, but no one had been able to harvest it for 30 years. Roan stood at the edge of the wasteland, gazing at the distant elm, and the brand beneath his collarbone glowed in time with his thoughts. Neither sword nor prayer grants resistance to poison. It is granted by those who wield that poison. Rowan had trained the granite bull Valen to the mature stage, gaining 14 points in fortitude, 17 in strength, and 9 in fatigue resistance, and the blacksmith Brom had become his ally after the incident with the wagon. That night, 4 hunters from the Tollbrook Free Guild attacked the farm, sent to witness the miracle da beasts, but Zola and Roan's new abilities allowed them to take everyone alive, and the senior hunter warned that more serious people would come for the ores. Roan decided to acquire poison resistance through ink bees from the old elm in the Thorn Wasteland until paper arrived from the city. Roan prepared for the elm tree as if for a siege. He sewed a hooded robe out of burlap and inserted a fine gnat net into the face opening. He fired up 4 clay smoke pots and spent a week adjusting the smoldering mixture until the smoke became thick and cold. Rotten alderwood with dried horse mushroom. The proportions came from a memory in which bees had once occupied an entire corner of the farm. True, those bees were ordinary, and their sting meant a blister, not a grave. Roan went to the elm tree 3 times. The first time, he simply sat 40 paces away for half the day and watched. The ink-black bees were twice as large as ordinary ones, with a blue-black sheen, and flew as heavily as shot. The second time, he approached within 10 paces with a smoke pipe and received his first sting on his wrist through the burlap. His arm went numb up to the elbow for a day, and the brand left a line that made Roan smile even through the pain. A small dose of ink bee venom has been received. Acclimatization has begun. Resistance to toxins has increased by 1 point. The brand counted the venom as a task. The third time, Roan arrived at dawn in the cold, when the bees were sluggish. He fumigated the hollow according to all the rules, cut a piece of comb with queen cells and a young larva from the honeycomb without touching the old queen, and carried his haul away in a shoulder basket, receiving 6 more stings in the process. He didn't walk home, he floated. The world was swaying. His heart skipped a beat every other one. For any other person, 6 stings from an ink bee would have put them in bed for a week or in the ground forever. Roan was pulled through with 14 parts of bull's strength. He rested for 2 days by the stove and got up with a line before his eyes, toxin resistance. 4 parts. At the boundary on a sunny hillock, Roan set down the first log. Then the second, the living boundary accepted the bees, as it accepted all living things. The young queen emerged, went on her nuptial flight, and by the first warm days the hives were buzzing so loudly they could be heard from the house. The clover bloomed, and the bees gathered nectar from it from dawn until dusk. Roan worked with them every day with his bare hands, first in a smock, then without a veil, then without anything at all. Every sting was a price paid and a contribution made. By the end of spring, the trial had drawn to a close. The bee colony had been brought to maturity through swarming. Resistance to toxins had increased to 21 units. A secondary ability had been unlocked, a sense for poison. The carrier recognizes poison in food, water, and air by a scent inaccessible to ordinary people. This sense proved itself in a terrifying way, and not on the farm. At the beginning of summer, a calamity struck the village one Westbrook hadn't seen in 3 generations. Vipers emerged from the large swamp across the river, not just 1 or 2, as in every summer, but in a flood. Black marsh vipers, as long as an arm, slithered across meadows, vegetable gardens, and yards as if a fire were driving them out of the swamp. On the very first day, the snakes bit 6 people. The herbalist, Lissa, and her grandmother, Old Myrta, brewed an antidote without stopping, but their herbs could counteract barely half the venom of the marsh viper. By evening, on the second day, the cooper's grandfather had died. On the third day, a snake bit the miller's 5-year-old daughter right on the porch of the mill. Roan was at the mill at that very moment, exchanging grain for Brun. He sprang into action before the village had even had time to cry out. He tied a belt around the girl's leg just above the bite. He cut open the wound with a knife he'd heated on the spot against a lamp and sucked out the venom, spitting it onto the floorboards. For anyone else, this would have meant poisoning through the gums. His 21-point resilience and a bee's instinct allowed him to handle the venom as if it were dirty water. He could sense how much poison had been drawn out and how much remained. Then he carried the girl in his arms halfway across the village to Myrta and told the old woman that the decoction should be given in quarter doses every hour rather than a full mug once a day, because a child's liver couldn't handle either the poison or the medicine all at once. Myrta, who had been treating Westbrook for 60 years, looked at the farmer through a cloud of hot steam, long and intently. Then she did as he said. By morning, the girl's fever had subsided. By evening, she asked for food. Myrta went out to the well where the villagers had gathered and announced to everyone that the boy from the farm on the wasteland knew more about poisons than she did, and that if anyone was bitten, they should run not to her, but to him. The old woman, who had spent her whole life calling her garden her healing garden, willingly let a stranger into that garden. The village buzzed with excitement and rushed the bitten people to the farm. Roan barely slept for 4 days. He sucked out and washed away the poison, applied straps and bandages, and sent boys running through the yards with quarter doses of the decoction. He lost 1 old man whose heart gave out before the poison could take effect, and he saved 11 people, including Degran, whom a viper had bitten in his boot near the tavern. Degran lay there, ashen-faced and silent, but just as Roan was leaving, he called after him that he had been wrong in the square on Stone Day. Roan replied that the stone had been wrong too, and went on to the next yard. By the end of the week, the stream of snakes had dried up just as suddenly as it had begun. The village breathed a sigh of relief, buried one, and celebrated 11. But Roan didn't celebrate. He sat on his property line, looking across the river at the dark strip of marsh, and asked himself a question that no one in the village had asked aloud. Snakes don't migrate from their native marsh in the summer. Something had driven the snakes away, something that made the vipers flee like water from under a boot. For the second day in a row, Zola had been pacing along the boundary, and the hair on her neck remained bristled. The boulder roared at sunset. The beasts knew the same thing Roan did. Something larger than anything Westbrook had ever seen had taken up residence in the swamp. The answer to the question of who exactly had come from the other side, and at the worst possible time. A wagon bearing Baron Craigmore's white and blue flag drove down the dried-up road into the village. The tax collector, Alvin, had arrived with 2 guards. He had come with the spring tax list, but the list looked strangely new. Alvin did not go to the village headman first, as was customary. Instead, he turned straight toward the abandoned farm, and Rowan, standing at the gate, watched as the official, with his small eyes, counted the rabbits, the bull, and the lynx. Ulfs unfolded the paper and announced, "According to reports from trusted sources, the land previously listed as barren has been recognized as particularly productive. The tax has been recalculated retroactively for the past year. The amount due is 40 in silver, or in kind, as per the inventory. The first item on the inventory was a bull of the granite breed. The second was a single wild lynx." Rowan listened and felt the brand beneath his collarbone grow warm in time with his rage. A report from trusted men. Fess, or the hunters, or all of them together. The letter from the city arrived as promised. Only it wasn't about the nugget, it was about his animals, which was both smarter and more underhanded. Taking his animals meant stripping him of everything without laying a finger on him. Roan asked in an even voice when the payment was due. Olven replied that it was 3 days and that a cart with a cage had already been ordered from the miller. Then the official smiled and added that if the farmer dared to resist the inventory, according to the code, that would be considered a riot, and in the event of a riot, it would be the Baron's guards in full armor who would arrive, not the tax collector. Behind Olven, a guard meaningfully placed his palm on the crossbow. Roan watched the 3 of them, and with the ears of a rabbit, heard something enormous sigh deeply and stir in the quagmire half a league across the river in the swamp. Roan had tamed the ink bees, brought the swarm to maturity, and gained 21 points of toxin resistance and a keen sense for poison. During the invasion of the swamp vipers, he saved 11 villagers, including Degran, and earned the recognition of the healer, Mirda, and the entire village. But he realized that something enormous had driven the snakes out of the swamp. The tax collector, Olven, acting on someone's tip-off, recalculated the tax at 40 silver, or in kind, based on an inventory of Valen and Zola, giving them 3 days to comply under threat of being charged with rebellion. Roan treated those 3 days as a military reserve. On the first day, he went not to the village head, but to the blacksmith. Brom listened to the story about the inventory in silence, finished his pipe, and said that he knew the Baron's code of laws better than the official did because 12 years ago he himself had been on trial over the smithy. According to the code, payment in kind is accepted only in the absence of coins. Coins settle the matter once and for all, and not even the Baron can appeal a payment made in silver. The problem was that there wasn't 40 in silver to be found in the entire village. After buying a goat, feed, and iron, Roan had 11 left. Brom dug 6 out of his chest and said it wasn't a debt but a share because he believed in the wasteland farm more than in the Baron's mercy. Myrta added another 5, wrapping the coins in a rag with dried mint. The miller gave 4 in memory of his daughter. Garth brought 2 in the wager from that very argument at the tavern. That made 28. They were 12 short, and there was nowhere to get them in 2 days. More precisely, there was nowhere to get them honestly and safely. But a dishonest and dangerous source lay across the river, sighing at night in the quagmire. On the evening of the first day, more guests arrived in Westbrook, and the village had already grown tired of being surprised. 5 horsemen in identical dark green cloaks bearing the insignia of the Tollbrook Trappers Guild. Not a loose band, but a real guild. The leader introduced himself as Master Tracker Cord and stated their purpose immediately and loudly. The guild was tracking a creature that had been ravaging the beaver traps downstream all spring, and now, by all indications, had taken up residence in the great swamp near Westbrook. The creature was listed in the registry as a fire-blooded serpent, a 4th-tier creature. The city was offering a bounty of 300 silver for its head. Cord was looking for a guide who knew the marshy region, and the entire village turned their heads toward the derelict farm as one. Roan stepped forward before he was called. He said he would guide them, but would not accept a share of the reward. Instead, he wanted a share of the spoils in kind of his own choosing. Cord eyed the gaunt farmer at whose feet sat a wasteland lynx, snorted, and agreed on the condition that the farmer not get in the way during the fight. Roan nodded. To himself, he noted that the tracker had hired him too easily and that Cord's eyes lit up for no good reason at the word farm. They set their departure for dawn. Roan took with him Zola the smoke-maker, a full box equipped as if for bees, and a coil of forged chain from Brahma's smithy. When Cord asked why a farmer would need a smoke maker, Roan replied that smoke is never a bad thing in the swamp. They made their way through the willow thicket along the edge of the quagmire. Roan led the way along animal trails that he read with Zola's eyes and heard with the ears of rabbits. By noon, he raised his hand and said they couldn't go any further because a creature lay downwind. The guild members heard nothing. Roan heard, 200 paces away, a breath as thick as a blacksmith's bellows, and another sound he hadn't expected, a faint bony clatter, many small sounds all at once. He told Cord about it. The tracker turned pale and cursed. The clatter meant the snake hadn't slithered into the swamp to fatten itself. The she-snake had come to lay her eggs. Eggs were hatching in the nest, and a disturbed 4th-stage mother would fight anyone to the death. The guild refused to retreat. 300 silver per head and double that for the clutch settled the matter. Cord positioned his men skillfully. 2 crossbowmen on dry hummocks, a spearman and a swordsman in a pincer formation. Roan was ordered to stand in the rear by the chain and hold his breath. The plan fell apart at the second beat of the battle's heart. The fire-blooded serpent emerged from the quagmire not where Cord had expected, but behind the crossbowmen's backs because its subterranean instincts had detected footsteps on the roots. The creature was 4 times a man's height, with a body as wide as a barrel and scales the color of cooling coal, across which veins of living fire ran. The first crossbowman managed to fire point blank, but the bolt bounced off the scales like an anvil. The tail swept the archer into the quagmire. The second archer bellowed and drove a bolt into the creature's eye socket. The serpent roared, and from its maw spewed not flame, but scorching air, which set the willow thicket ablaze like gunpowder. From that point on, Roan was no longer a spectator. He saw what the guild members, preoccupied with survival, did not see. He saw that the creature was fighting at half strength because it was using its entire body to shield the nest mound from the people. He saw that the heat of its breath came in waves with a pause of 6 heartbeats between them because its fiery blood needed time to ignite. And he sensed with a bee's instinct that the smoke from his smoke pot, packed with fresh rotten alder wood, was drifting downwind, straight toward the nest. Snakes have no eyelids. Acidic smoke is torture for them. Roan fanned the smoke box and walked not away from the creature but toward it, tracing an arc from the side of the masonry. Cord yelled at his back that the farmer had lost his mind. Roan didn't answer. He placed the smoking box on the leeward side of the nest, and thick, cold smoke flowed toward the mound. The female snake jerked her whole body, torn between the men and the nest, which was being choked by the smoke. This brief hesitation was enough for the spearman to drive his spear under the scales into the armpit of the front ridges, and for the axeman to sever the spine 3 cubits from the head. The creature thrashed about for a long time. As it died, it exhaled a final wave of heat, and the wave engulfed Roan completely because he was dragging it away from the stunned crossbowman's blow. Roan's clothes began to smolder. Crimson spots appeared on his skin, but 14 points of bull's fortitude and 21 points of endurance absorbed what would have killed anyone else in the squad. He remained on his feet with the man on his shoulder, and through the ringing in his ears heard a line from the brand. A dose of Fireblood's heat received. Acclimation begun. Heat resistance increased by 2 points. Then silence fell, and in that silence, the guild tallied its losses and gains. 1 fighter had drowned in the quagmire. 1 had been burned to a crisp. The viper's head was worth 300 silver, and on the nest mound, amid a pile of rotten grass, lay 9 eggs, each the size of 2 fists and the color of cooling ash. Cord beamed and was already calculating aloud that the alchemists of Tollbrook would pay 50 per egg for this clutch. Roan approached the mound, removed his gauntlet, and placed his palm on the nearest egg. 8 of the shells were hot, just like stones by a campfire. The 9th egg beneath his palm thudded from within. The brand beneath his collarbone flared up so intensely that Roan's breath caught in his throat. An embryo of a high-blooded creature in a state of decline has been detected. The clutch will cool without a mother within a day. Fostering is possible. Attention! A creature of the highest bloodline raised from the shell will grant its bearer a share of qualities inaccessible to mortals. Roan straightened up and reminded Cord of their agreement in front of all the fighters. The share is to be paid in kind, at the guide's discretion. He chooses 1 egg. That's the one. Cord stopped smiling. The tracker said slowly that he remembered the agreement, but that the guild would be held accountable to the city for the live clutch of a fire-blooded serpent, and that an unaccounted-for egg in the hands of a village prodigy was exactly what certain people in Tollbrook had asked him to investigate. Cord pronounced the word self-made with relish, and the 5 guild members, as if by chance, rearranged themselves into a semicircle. Behind Roan, Zola growled. Roan stood in the middle of the scorched swamp holding the warm egg in which a heart was beating in his singed hand, and realized 3 things at once. There was 1 day left until the tax was due. 5 professionals stood against him, and what was beating beneath the shell was worth any fight in this world. The village had pooled 28 silver out of the required 40, and Master Cord's Beast Hunters Guild had arrived in Westbrook for a 4th-tier fire-blooded serpent, and Roan had signed on as a guide for a share in kind. In the swamp battle, Roan used smoke to distract the female serpent from her nest, thereby deciding the outcome. He gained 2 points of heat resistance and, as agreed, selected by lot the only viable egg from the clutch, in which the brand recognized the embryo of a creature of the highest bloodline. Cord refused to hand over the egg, hinting that he was acting on orders from the people of Tollbrook, and 5 guild members surrounded Roan in the scorched swamp one day before the tax payment deadline. Roan did not wait for the semicircle to close in on him. He spoke first, and he spoke calmly. He said that the guild had just lost 1 fighter in the quagmire, and that a 2nd lay there, burned, and unable to stand without help. He said that none of the 5 would find their way back through the swamp without a guide, because the water would rise by nightfall and flood the passages. He said he was ready to lead them all out and carry the wounded man on his back, but the egg would go with him according to the agreement that everyone had heard. Then he fell silent and let the silence do its work. The silence worked in his favor. The charred willow bushes smoldered. The quagmire gurgled. Somewhere deep in the swamp, a whole chorus of small creatures echoed the death of the viper, and that chorus did not promise an easy night. The guild fighters exchanged glances. A spearman named Vargo said aloud that a deal was a deal, and that he hadn't agreed to take a share from the man who had saved his life as a chimney sweep. Rubaka nodded. The crossbowman, whom Roan had pulled out from under the heat wave, looked at Cord, and his gaze was heavy. Cord was just as good at reading people as Rowan. The tracker stretched his lips into a smile and said he'd been joking, that the guild honored its agreements, and that certain people from Tollbrook would be waiting for a report. Rowan nodded, but didn't believe a single word. He hoisted the scorched crossbowman onto his back, pressed the egg against his chest under his shirt, right against his skin, and led the squad out of the swamp. They walked until dark. The egg near his heart was beating from within, growing fainter and fainter, and Rowan felt that fading beat as if it were his own. The embryo needed its mother's warmth, but its mother lay dead on a hummock. At the very edge of the swamp, Rowan stopped and did something that made the guild members freeze. He called out into the darkness, and Valen emerged from it. That very morning, Rowan had paid a village shepherd a copper coin to bring the bull to the edge of the swamp. By sunset, the granite bull, weighing 1/4 of a metric ton, approached its master like a calf. Rowan laid the wounded man on the bull's broad back between its shoulder blades, secured him with straps, and the party set off toward the village at a speed no cart could match. In Westbrook, the entire town square, lit by torches, turned out to greet the guild. The Snake Queen's head, severed with a sword back in the swamp, was rolled out of a sack near the well, and the village howled with delight and horror. The creature that had driven the snakes from the swamp was dead. Cord announced that without a guide, the entire guild would have perished in the quagmire, and that the farmer's share had been agreed upon and paid. He said this loudly and in front of witnesses, and Rowan assessed the situation. Now, any loss of the egg would lead straight to the guild, and Cord had cut off that path himself to lull the natural-born talent into a false sense of security. Back home, Rowan set about the main task. The egg was cooling. The brand was counting down the embryo's demise in fractions, and those fractions were melting away. Rowan sifted through the memories of both his lives. An incubator. He needed an incubator with steady heat and humidity, but his only tools were a furnace, sand, and his hands. He scooped hot ash from the furnace, sifted it, mixed it with dry river sand, and poured it into an oak tub in layers, testing the heat with his elbow the way one tests water for a baby. He laid the egg in the sand. On top, Rowan placed a wet mat to trap the steam. Every 2 hours, day and night, he replaced the cooled sand with fresh, warmed sand and dripped water onto the mat. After a day, the branding iron indicated that the fading had stopped. 2 days later, it indicated that the embryo was growing stronger. Rowan slept on the floor next to the tub, dozing fitfully, just as he had once slept by the birthing stalls during the most difficult calvings. And on the morning of the 3rd day, the tax deadline expired, and Olvin's wagon pulled up to the farm with a cage and 2 guards. Olvin entered the yard with the inventory list at the ready, and with the expression of a man who had come to collect. Rowan brought him a rag and poured out 40 silver coins, one by one, onto the inventory. 28 were from the village's share, and 12 were from the guild's commission, which Cord had counted out the previous evening in front of witnesses. Olvin counted them twice. The official's face grew longer and longer. Someone in Tollbrook needed the goods in kind, and the coins were throwing a wrench in the works. Olvin said he'd recount the goods and submit them again in the fall. Rowan replied that they'd talk about it in the fall. The cart with the empty cage rolled away, and Rowan exhaled for the first time in 3 days. The days that followed were spent setting things up. Rowan built a warm corner with double walls in the barn and kept a tub of eggs there, changing the sand like clockwork. Rowan mowed the floodplain meadow and raised a second haystack because the number of eaters was growing. Rowan received 2 litters at once from the female rabbits, and the herd exceeded 30. The brand was dripping in portions. The herd had grown to 24 animals. The herd's reputation had spread to 15. Meanwhile, in the village, what Rowan had foreseen but underestimated was coming to fruition: fame. After the swamp and the snake plague, people began flocking to the farm. The miller asked him to look after a sick horse. The cooper brought over some coughing piglets. Rowan treated them because he didn't know how not to. And every animal he cured spoke louder for him than a town crier. Myrta came twice a week to exchange herbs for honey from ink bees, and in front of everyone called Rowan her colleague. Hubert began hinting at a seat on the village council. After the Viper incident, DeGran followed Rowan around like a tail and begged to be hired. Roan took him on for haymaking and didn't regret it because the second-star spearman could handle a pitchfork for 2 men. But the louder the name was spoken, the more attentively strangers' ears listened. The Hunters Guild left for the city with the Snake Queen's head and 8 eggs. They left quietly and all too politely, and 2 weeks later, a man arrived on the summer road to Westbrook, a man Roan had been waiting for ever since the skirmish in the marsh, and yet he still found himself unprepared. It wasn't a detachment or a collector who arrived. A covered wagon with a coat of arms on the door arrived. A silver owl on a blue field. A woman of about 40 stepped out of the wagon wearing a traveling gown, more expensive than the entire tavern put together, accompanied by a scribe and 2 silent guards whose bearing spoke to Roan more than any coat of arms. That is how people of the 5th star stand. The woman introduced herself as Master Idella, keeper of the menagerie of his lordship Baron Craigmore, and from the threshold placed a sealed document on the blacksmith's table where she was staying. The document declared that, according to reports from loyal subjects, a bearer of an unrecorded gift of taming had been discovered on the lands of Westbrook, and that according to the Baron's code, all bearers of rare gifts were required to report to the court for evaluation and enrollment. The word enrollment in the code meant service for life. Idella did not go to the farm to conduct a search. She acted more wisely. She sent for Rowan with an invitation to a conversation, and Rowan went because running from the Baron's summons would mean betraying the village. The conversation lasted an hour. Idella did not threaten him. Idella laid out the future before Rowan just as a merchant lays out fabric, a stone house in Tollbrook, a salary of 30 silver per month, the finest beasts from the Baron's menagerie at his disposal, protection of his coat of arms from the guilds and from people worse than the guilds, people the Magister had mentioned in passing, but with great significance. In return, Rowan's gift would serve the Baron. His beasts would grow in the Baron's enclosures. His body would be strengthened according to the Baron's specifications and for the Baron's wars. Rowan listened politely and heard the essence between the lines. Idella knew about the nature of his abilities. She didn't suspect, she knew. Someone had sold to Tollbrook not mere rumors about large rabbits, but the very essence of the brand, and Roan could count on one hand the number of people who were that well informed. He replied to the master that he was flattered and that he would think it over until fall, because the harvest and the livestock would not let him go in the middle of summer. Idella smiled with just her lips and said that his grace would wait until fall, but winter would hardly do so. Then, standing by the wagon and looking Roan in the eyes, she added that she strongly advised him not to raise anything that flew or breathed fire until fall, because the law now prescribed not a fine, but a bonfire for such an offense. The wagon rolled away. Roan stood on the road and felt the warmth of the eggshell beneath his shirt close to his heart, the one he now carried with him in a woven basket, not daring to leave it behind. And at that very moment, the egg struck from within 3 times, strongly and insistently, and the first crack ran across the shell with a dry crack. Roan led the guild out of the swamp, kept the egg as agreed, and paid Olvin a tax of 40 silver, thwarting the plan to confiscate the beasts in kind. He is nurturing the egg in a tub of hot sand. His fame is growing. Degran has become a worker, and the population and quality shares have increased to 24 parts of agility and 15 points in perception. Magister Idella, the Baron's menagerie keeper, arrived with a document registering bearers of rare gifts. She offered her services until fall, hinted that she knew the truth behind the trader's brand, and forbade the breeding of fire-breathing creatures. And at that very moment, the egg began to hatch. Roan ran to the farm without even noticing the road. He placed the box in a warm corner of the barn, herded Zola off her bed to the guardhouse door, and knelt down in front of the tub. The crack was spreading. Steam rose from beneath the shell. His memory reminded him, harshly and clearly, you must not help a creature hatch. A chick or a young animal must emerge on its own. Otherwise, it will be weak. All you can do is keep it warm and wait. Roan changed the sand, warmed the water, and waited for 6 hours. Behind the wall, Valun paced back and forth and sighed. Zola lay by the door, her snout pointed toward the crack, and did not sleep. Around midnight, the shell split in two, and a creature 2 palms long began to stir in the steamy sand. Not a snake. Roan watched and could not believe his eyes at first. 4 paws with claws, membranous wings clumped together like wet leaves, a crest running from the nape of the neck to the tail, scales the color of cooling ash, with veins that glowed faintly from within. The mark unfurled its lines, and the lines trembled like air above a fire. A creature of the highest blood has been taken into custody from the shell. Species identified, ash dragon. Birth level 0, no upper level limit detected. Warning, a creature of the highest bloodline grows only in the presence of its host and only on living warmth. Separation, lasting longer than a day during the first year, leads to its demise. Roan held out his hand, and the little dragon nuzzled his palm with its snout like a calf at a udder. The skin beneath the scales was as hot as the side of a furnace. Roan sat in the barn at night, holding in his palms the creature for which the Baron's code promised a bonfire, and laughed quietly, almost soundlessly, because the choice he had feared had made itself. His service to the Baron ended before it even began. He wouldn't give the dragon to anyone. Roan named the little dragon Cole. For the first week, Cole ate mashed liver mixed with honey from ink bees every 3 hours and slept tucked into Roan's bosom because living warmth was literally a matter of life and death under the conditions of the brand. Roan went about his farm work with the dragon under his shirt, and to outsiders he looked like a man who had grown a hump and was talking to it. DeGran saw Cole on the 10th day when he happened to walk into the barn at the wrong time. The spearman froze in his tracks, swallowed hard, and asked in a whisper if this was what he thought it was. Roan replied that this was the kind of thing for which both the witness and the informant would be hanged. Degran paused and said that he was now a farmhand, and a farmhand doesn't betray his employer's property. Then he asked permission to touch it. Cole nipped his finger, and Degran walked around as proud as a standard-bearer. So the secret now had 3 keepers, counting Myrta, whom Roan had told himself because without her herbs he couldn't feed the growing furnace. Cole grew like a fire. The living boundary, woven from the highest blood, provided growth that made Roan rewrite his notebook. After a month, the dragon was the size of Zola. By 1.5 months, he was chasing rabbits around the yard, not for food, but for play, and to Roan's horror, the rabbits played with him. Cole didn't breathe fire. Cole breathed heat, just like his mother, and he did it for the first time with a sneeze. The haystack by the barn caught fire instantly. Roan spent half the night putting out the fire, and the next morning he set aside a separate mud brick area for the dragon's sneezes and began training. He didn't train using commands. He trained the way a shepherd's apprentice is taught, by working alongside the animal, repetition, rewards of warmth and food. The shepherd's gift made the beast quick to learn, though Cole was smarter than a dog even without it. By the end of summer, the dragon could target a mark 20 paces away with a hand gesture and catch the air with its wing on its first attempts at flight, and the branding dripped not by drops, but by buckets. He inherited the legacy of the highest bloodline. Heat resistance increased to 17 units. Bone strength increased by 12. Perception increased by 9. The bearer's ability has been unlocked. Breath of the horn. The bearer can heat the air in front of them with a short exhalation. The ability grows along with the creature. The first time Roan tried the breath of the horn was in a wasteland, far from prying eyes. He exhaled, the air in front of his face shimmered, and a thorn bush 3 paces away withered and began to smolder. Roan stood there, staring at his own hands. A farmer? A gray light? No stars? Autumn arrived with the wagon trains and the price to pay for summer. The first price was the harvest that left the village speechless. The living boundary now covered an area 3 times larger because Roan had bought a wedge of wasteland from the community for a pittance. The barley stood as tall as a man. Turnips the size of a head grew from the ridges. Roan sold the surplus to Fess, and Fess paid without haggling. And while the merchant's eyes darted around the yard, searching for something, rumors of the unaccounted-for gift spread along the highways. The second price was the village council, to which Roan was ultimately elected against his will. Hubert declared in front of everyone that Westbrook now made more of a living from the wasteland farm than from the mill, and that a farmer's vote carried weight. Roan accepted the vote, but noted to himself that the higher they put him, the easier it would be to take aim at him. The third retribution arrived in mid-fall, dressed in white and blue. Ulvin. The tax collector had come to tally the taxes as promised, but he arrived not with 2 guards, but with a dozen, accompanied by a covered, windowless wagon and a man in a gray cloak, whom Roan recognized instantly. The Silent One from the Fest Tower. Now the Silent One stood behind Ulvin's shoulder and stared at Roan just as unblinkingly. Ulvin announced the new assessment. First-class land of exceptional productivity, tax 200 silver per year, have to be paid immediately. If payment is impossible, an inventory in kind according to the attached list, and the first item on the list was a scaly, flammable, unaccounted for creature, 1 specimen. Roan listened and grew cold, not because of the amount, because of that item. No one knew about the coal except for the 3 of them, and the beasts were silent by definition. Ulvin stared at the paper. The gray Silent One looked at the barn. He was looking directly at the warm corner behind the double wall where the dragon, exhausted from the night's hunt, was now sleeping. And Roan understood with a clarity that made his jaw clench. The Silent One didn't suspect a thing. The Silent One sensed it. The Baron had his own bearer of the gift in his service, and that gift led him to other people's beasts, like a bee to honey, Roan replied calmly. He said he would challenge the assessment before the Baron's court as having been illegally recalculated twice in 1 year because the blacksmith Brom knew the code and Roan knew the blacksmith. He said that, according to the same code, the inventory would be suspended until the trial. Alwyn grimaced, but nodded because the paperwork was against him. And the silent, gray-haired man spoke for the first time in 2 seasons. His voice was quiet and expressionless. He said that the trial would be held in Tollbrook this winter. He said that the farmer would have to travel there himself, along with the property in dispute. And he said, looking Roan in the eye, that the road to Tollbrook was long, and in winter, trouble lurked on the highways, and people vanished along with their possessions, so the farmer should prepare carefully. The detachment rode off. Roan stood in the middle of the yard in the autumn twilight. Behind the barn wall, Ugal woke up and swished his tail. In Tollbrook, a trial awaited him, one that was a trap. The road itself was a trap as well. And somewhere nearby walked the trader who had revealed the essence of the brand to Adele because the gray sentinel had explained the surveillance, but hadn't explained the magistrate's knowledge of the nature of the qualities. Roan returned to the house, took out a notebook, and wrote 2 columns on a blank page. In the first, he listed everyone who knew the farm from the inside. In the second, he began to write down what needed to be grown on the farm by winter so that the road to Tollbrook would become a trap, not for him, but for the hunters. The first column turned out to be short and all the more terrifying for it. Roan worked on the second column until morning. An ash dragon named Cole hatched from the egg, a creature of the highest bloodline with no limit to its growth, capable of developing only alongside its host, and Roan gained 17 points of heat resistance, 12 points of bone strength, 9 points of keen vision, and the ability Breath of the Horn. Only Degran and Myrta know about the dragon, but the farm yielded an unprecedented harvest, and Roan was elected to the village council. Ulvin, accompanied by a dozen guards and a silent, gray-haired man who turned out to have a keen sense for foreign beasts, calculated a tax of 200 silver pieces, with an inventory listing the dragon as the first item. Roan contested the assessment in court in Tollbrook that winter, and the silent man openly threatened that the road to court would be the farmer's last. Roan silently referred to the second column in his notebook as his winter schedule. There were about 3 months left until the trial, and he scheduled each week of those months as if it were planting season. He needed eyes in the sky because an ambush on the road could be spotted from a league away. He needed speed faster than a rabbit's because you can't outrun a mounted pursuit on foot. And he needed what he'd been thinking about ever since that skirmish in the swamp. a creature whose abilities acted not on the body, but on another's will, because it was not swords, but seals and denunciations that were being used against him. He found the eyes in the sky first and almost for free. For a share of the honey, Garth retrieved 2 gray-winged falcon chicks from a nesting cliff above the river. They'd fallen out after a storm. An ordinary falconer would have raised them for a year. Living Boundary in Roan's hands had the birds flying within 5 weeks. The mark assessed the breed as sturdy and added 11 points of keen sight, bringing it to 20. Roan could now read the mark on Fess's wagon from the hill half a league away and make out in twilight what others could not see. In broad daylight, he named the falcons east and west and trained them to circle above the highway at the sound of a whistle. Speed, however, proved more difficult and expensive to achieve. At the horse fair in neighboring Millbrook, Roan wasn't looking for a horse. Horses were sold for a share of the profits. The brand had already revealed this with his grandfather's mare, bought that spring. He was looking for a beast from the pedigree lists and found it in the very back row, where a dealer was selling for a song a cage containing a creature that everyone else had passed by. A steppe whirltail, a creature of the houndcat breed, the size of a calf, with a coat of mottled gray. The peddler had taken it from a passing circus performer to settle a debt and had suffered until his hair turned gray because the whirltail wouldn't eat. It thrashed against the bars and was on the verge of death. Roan looked into the beast's eyes and saw not malice, but the longing of a hunted runner with nowhere left to run. He bought the cage for 3 silver pieces amid the laughter of the entire row. Back home, he didn't open the cage in the yard. He took it out to the wasteland, opened the door, and sat down beside it with his back to the beast. Whirlwind shot out like a gray bolt of lightning and vanished. Day Green said that for 3 silver it had made a fine escape. Roan ordered that a bowl of offal be set out on the wasteland every evening. For a week, the bowl stood untouched. On the 8th evening, it was empty. On the 12th night, Whirltail ate in front of Roan 20 paces away. By the time the first snow fell, the beast named Squall was sleeping in the barn on the hay between Valoon and Zola, and the brand, having voluntarily taken him under its wing, gave the bearer the very thing for which the whole endeavor had begun. The speed of the burst was 15 parts. Roan, on a bet with Degran, outran his grandfather's mare, who was galloping in a straight line, and Degran spent 3 days telling everyone he met about it until Roan told him to shut up. The third and darkest remained, will against will. Roan read the answer in his own notebook, sifting through the entries Myrta had given him to copy. Among the creatures of the marshes was the Night Whisperer, a small marsh owl, about which the healers said its gaze drew one's eyes away, and its voice confused one's thoughts. Hunters would strike the whisperers on the fly, not letting them get a good look at themselves. Myrta said that in her youth, a witch from the highlands had kept a whisperer, and that people would go to that witch to forget their sorrows. Roan listened and went into the winter swamp on his own. He searched for 6 nights, relying on his hearing, 15, and his eyesight, 20. On the 7th night, he found a hollow in a dry alder tree and a clump of feathers inside it. The whisperer was young, thin, and half dead from starvation because the snake plague had wiped out all the mice in the swamp that summer. Roan didn't catch him. Roan placed a frozen field mouse from the rabbit pen on the snow beneath the hollow and left. He brought food for 12 nights in a row, treading the same ski trail. On the 13th night, the owl swooped down onto his shoulder of its own accord and looked him in the eyes. The world swayed. Roan heard not words but a pressure in his own head, as if someone were gently advising him to lie down in the snow and fall asleep. The brand flared up, attempt to influence the host repelled. Second-tier creature voluntarily taken under protection. Species, Night Whisperer, attribute points awarded, willpower 8 units, ability unlocked, silent canopy. The host can divert the attention of a single person by making themselves and their creatures invisible to a passing glance. Rowan was walking home across the nighttime swamp with an owl on his shoulder, testing the canopy on hares. The hares could no longer see him up close. By midwinter, Roan's farm was no longer a farm. Digran used to say it was an outpost, 36 rabbits, a bull, a lynx, a whirlwind tail, 2 falcons, an owl, bees sleeping in the logs, and a dragon the size of a good wolfhound that would soar over the wasteland at night, practicing its gliding flight. Roan totaled the final column in his notebook and read it over twice. Agility 24 and Sprint 15, Strength 17 and Physical Constitution 14, Bone Strength 12, Resistance to Poison 21 and Resistance to Heat 17, Hearing 15, Vision 20, Willpower 8, Breath of the Horn, Silent Canopy, Living Boundary. A year and a half ago, he had awakened in the body of a teenager on a meager plot of land. The mark rated his current body between the 3rd and 4th tiers of beings and showed no upper limit. A week before leaving for Tollbrook, Roan had resolved the last question in the first column. The question about the traitor. He set traps with his words. To Murda, he said he would haul the dragon in a sleigh under a load of hay. To Digran, he said he would leave the dragon with Murda. To Garth, with whom he shared honey, he said he would send the dragon ahead through the air at night. 3 versions. 3 people. And he himself, with the help of the silent canopy, lay in the snow by the road for the 3rd night, watching to see who would be traveling toward the city and with what. On the 4th night, a rider passed along the road. Roan recognized the riding style before he saw the face. The rider sat in the saddle like a sack because he'd ridden a pack horse his whole life. Fess, the merchant, was driving his horse into the night without a wagon or servants, which was unthinkable for a merchant. Roan sent Vostok after him, and the falcon led Fess to an inn at the fork in the road, where a man was waiting for the merchant, a man whom Fess entered without knocking. Roan lay in the loft of the inn's stable, where he had slipped in under the canopy and listened through a crack in the ceiling with the hearing of 15 parts. Fess's voice trembled and sounded hurried. The merchant was recounting Hart's version of events to the silent, gray-haired man. The dragon would fly ahead of its master at night. Roan lay in the cold straw, and inside he felt calm and empty. Not Myrda, not Digran, Garth, the hunter who had brought him falcons and shared mead with him. But Roan didn't have time to finish his thought because the silent one downstairs began to speak, and from his very first words, the emptiness filled with lead. The silent one said that the story about the flight matched 2 other reports because the farmer was obviously testing people and had fed each one their own version. The silent one said it didn't matter. They'd changed their minds about taking the beast on the road. They'd take it in Tollbrook itself at the trial, where the farmer would bring himself, and the beast, being of the highest blood by nature, could not endure separation from its bearer for more than a day, and will inevitably crawl after it, whether through the air or across the ground. Mulchin said that the trial date has already been set. The farmer will be taken into custody right in the courtroom on charges that are already prepared, and Judge Idla will confirm them personally. And then the silent one added one last thing. He said that the order for the natural-born one did not come from the barren. The barren will only get the scraps. The order comes from the capital, from people whose names Fessu is not authorized to know, and these people have ordered that the carrier be delivered alive and without fail with the brand intact because they are familiar with the shepherd's brand, and this is not the first one on the carrier that they can recall. Roan assembled his winter kit, acquiring the East and West Falcons with 20 units of keen sight, the Whirltail Squall with 15 units of burst speed, and the Night Whisperer with 8 units of willpower and the Silent Veil ability, which diverts attention. Through a trap involving 3 versions, he discovered that the tip-offs came from all 3 of those being investigated, but the courier turned out to be Fess, and the Gray Silent One saw through the investigation. An overheard conversation revealed that there would be no ambush on the road. The farmer would be arrested directly at the court in Tollbrook with Idela's support, counting on the dragon to crawl up after the messenger, and that the order for Rowan was coming from... On his way back, Rowan ran in fits and starts through the nighttime wasteland, his thoughts racing just as erratically. The Silent One's words turned the tables. He had been preparing to play against the Baron, but was actually playing against the capital. He thought the brand was a secret, but it turned out to be an object with its own history and former bearers whom those people still remembered. And most importantly, the court's trap was built on Cole's nature. Separation for more than a day kills a first-year dragon. So by taking Roan into custody, they were getting a dragon for free. For the entire following week, Roan built a counter-trap, crafting it from the same material the enemy's trap was made of, the code, the nature of beasts, and human greed. First, he went to Brahm and spent 2 evenings with the blacksmith, poring over the lists and the code. Brahm found what they were looking for, a section on trials of honor. A free farmer accused in a property dispute had the right to demand a trial not in the Baron's court, but in an open courtyard before witnesses from the 3 estates, provided he posted a bail of 100 silver. An open courtyard meant a crowd. A crowd meant that a quiet arrest in the hall would turn into a public seizure in front of merchants, artisans, and priests, something even the capital's patrons would never have ordered to be done in broad daylight. Roan had the 100 silver. The autumn harvest and the honey had yielded more than expected. Then Roan turned his attention to the nature of beasts. And here his plan was so daring, it made him tremble. Cole couldn't stay at home. Cole couldn't ride in a sleigh because the seer guided him as if by a string. That meant Cole had to be with Roan so that the Silent One's intuition would scream while everyone else's eyes remained silent. For 2 weeks, Roan drove the Silent Canopy to the point of exhaustion, training it on Daegron, on Murda, and on the entire village at once on Market Day. The ability grew with work, just like a muscle. By the time of their departure, Roan could hold the canopy not over just 1 person, but over 3, and sustain it for hours. And the Whispering Owl sat on his shoulder, and Roan was amazed to discover that next to her the canopy stretched more easily, as if the bird were propping it up with its dark craft. Greed was the 3rd layer. Roan called for Fess. The merchant arrived with darting eyes, and Roan, looking into those eyes, proposed a deal that made Fess's palms sweat. Roan said he knew about the merchant's nighttime trips and that he held no grudge, because everyone makes a living as best they can. Then he laid a pre-drafted document on the table, a contract for the supply of live goods, from the wasteland farm to the Baron's court, 20 mature heather rabbits, honey from ink bees by Pood, and in a separate line item, animals for display in his lordship's menagerie, to be delivered by the owner himself to the winter court. Fess read it but didn't understand. Roan explained it simply. The merchant would take this contract to the Silent One and say that the farmer had given in and was coming to trade his menagerie in the hope of buying his way out. Let them wait in Tollbrook for the wagon train with the cages. In return, Roan would forget whose horses had stood by the fork in the road at night, and Fess would receive his lawful interest on the bet, because the paper was genuine and the money in it was real. Fess rode off in a daze, carrying away the truth that was a lie. The caravan left Westbrook 10 days before the trial. 2 sleds carried cages where the rabbits sat, and logs filled with honey followed. Riding on horseback were Degran with the spear and Garth with a bow, which Roan had deliberately brought along to keep the traitor in sight and within shooting range of his new masters. Roan drove the lead sled. An owl slept at his feet in the travel box. Valen walked on a lead rope as a spare draft animal. Zola and Shkval moved through the forest parallel to the road, invisible from it. The falcons circled, taking turns. And Ugol flew at night from grove to grove. Guided by a whistle he could hear a league away, and by day lay in the thickets beneath the largest canopy Roan could cast from a distance. And the canopy held because, after a month of training, its power had grown to affect a single target from afar, provided the target was one of their own. The journey took 6 days and involved 3 combat tests. On the 3rd day, at the bridge across the Ledianka, the caravan encountered 5 men in rags wielding pikes, who were pretending to be dashing warriors so earnestly that Roan, with his 20-part acuity, could make out identical felt underarmor beneath their rags. a test. Molchun checked the wagon train's guards and, at the same time, scanned the sky to see if anyone was flying above the sleigh. Roan played the part of a frightened peasant, bribed them with 2 rabbits and a barrel of honey, and the 5 men left satisfied, while Vostok watched from above as they made their way to the Baron's post station, where the disguised men handed over their loot to the foreman. On the 5th day, at the inn, a priest from the roadside temple sat down next to Rowan and began speaking of a gift from God that it would be a sin to hide from the authorities. The priest smelled of office ink, not wax. Rowan replied humbly and foolishly, and the priest left him alone. And on the last night before reaching the city, what Rowan had been waiting for, most of all, happened, and yet he nearly slept right through it. The Silent One came on his own, alone, on foot. He walked through the sleeping inn so quietly that even Roan's 15-fold hearing only picked up on him at the very last moment. The sensitive one wasn't looking for Roan. The scent seeker followed the trail of his gift to the barn behind the yard, where Cole, who had flown in that evening, lay under a canopy in a sleigh box. Roan intercepted him in the yard, stepping out of the shadows like a master stepping into the wind. The two stood in the snow, facing each other, and said nothing. Then the Silent One said quietly that he sensed a beast 30 paces away, but his eyes could not see the beast, and that he had never encountered a canopy like this in 20 years of service. He said that now he understood why the capital paid more for this brand than for any other province. And then he did something Roan hadn't expected. The Silent One rolled up his sleeve and showed an old white scar on his forearm in the shape of a circle made of ears of grain and animal tracks, branded, seared with red-hot iron. Molchin said that he had once been called by a different name and that he had borne the shepherd's brand for 7 years until the people from the capital took him to the white basements, where they extract the qualities from the bearer drop by drop, along with the bearer himself. He said that he escaped empty-handed and that he serves as a tracker because all that remains of his gift is a sense for foreign beasts. He said that he had been ordered to bring Rowan to the courtroom, and he would do so because those held hostage in exchange for his service remained in the capital. But in the courtroom, there would be a moment between the reading of the verdict and the arrest, and during that moment, the guards would stand by the doors rather than at the dais. Then the Silent One turned and walked off into the darkness without waiting for a reply. Roan stood in the courtyard until dawn. In the morning, the convoy rolled through the gates of Tollbrook. The city came alive with the clamor of stone and the smell of thousands of stoves. In the square by the courthouse, they were already erecting an open platform because the bail of 100 silver, paid through a money changer 3 days before the deadline, had done its job. In the court of honor had been scheduled to take place in the open courtyard. Town criers were shouting about the case of the farmer, the miracle worker from the midnight lands, and the town was flocking to watch. Roan was unhitching the sleigh at the inn when the east fell from the sky onto the railing and screamed. Roan looked up, his gaze following the falcon's line of sight. Above the southern road, far beyond the rooftops, 36 horsemen were marching toward the city in battle formation under a banner whose meaning Roan did not know. A white field, and on it a black broken chain. And the brand beneath his collarbone, for the first time in a year and a half, did not grow warm, but ached sharply and viciously, like an old scar in inclement weather. Through Brahma, Roan secured a trial by honor in the open courtyard by posting bail of 100 silver, turning the arrest into an impossible public capture, and Fessa took advantage of the cover of darkness by feeding the Silent One a legend about a trade caravan. The caravan reached Tollbrook with coal flying through the nights under the distant canopy of the silent sky. Having withstood 3 inspections, the Silent One turned out to be a former bearer of the shepherd's brand, seared by the capital's people in white cellars. He serves on bail provided by his loved ones, but he tipped Roan off about the moment between the announcement and the arrest. Meanwhile, 36 horsemen, under a foreign flag, bearing a black open chain, were approaching the city, and Roan's brand responded to them with pain. The trial was set for noon, and by morning, the square in front of the chamber was so packed that the guards had to clear a path with their pikes. Rumors of the miracle-working farmer had done a better job than any town crier. Merchants came to inspect the goods. Artisans came to see the curiosity. Priests came to investigate possible heresy. Rowan rode into the square on a sleigh, pulled by horses and carrying cages, just as the legend had promised, and the crowd let out a cry upon seeing rabbits the size of sheep. Valen walked behind the sleigh, and the boys ran alongside, ducking under his belly. Zola sat in the sleigh at Rowan's feet, wearing a collar for show, and the front rows recoiled back. Ogol lay curled up in the large sleigh box beneath sacks of wool 30 paces from the platform under the canopy, which Rowan now held up with almost no effort because the owl was perched on his shoulder, and the crowd regarded her as a tame curiosity. 3 people sat at the judge's table on the platform. The city judge from the chamber, the captain of the merchants, 100 from the estates, and Master Adela from the baron's court. Adela's eyes found Rowan immediately, and in her gaze was the cold curiosity of a person looking at a beast already caged. Along the edges of the square, Rowan, with eyesight 20 times sharper than average, took in what the crowd could not see. 4 pairs of guards, not wearing the city's colors, stood at all the exits, standing too rigidly for mere onlookers. And on the gallery of the cloth merchants' row above the square stood a silent, gray-clad man, gazing not at the platform, but at the sleigh box beneath the sacks, his face betraying no emotion. The proceedings began with a proclamation. Ulvin read aloud the tax assessment of 200 silver and the inventory. Brom, who had arrived as a witness from the Artisans Guild, stood up and dissected the tax assessment item by item according to the code, just as one would dismantle an axle. The tax is not recalculated twice a year. The classification of the land is confirmed by a surveyor, but there was no surveyor at the farm. The merchant council leader listened and nodded because the merchants themselves were howling at Ulvin's recalculations. The judge scratched with his quill. The crowd was cheering for the farmer. It was all heading toward the calculation collapsing, and then Adela stood up. The magistrate spoke softly, and the square fell silent. She said that the dispute over the tax was a trifle. She said that standing before the court was the bearer of an unaccounted-for gift who had concealed the gift from the crown, which, according to the code, was a crime in and of itself. She said that the baron's court was prepared to overlook the offense if the bearer voluntarily accepted the charge here and now. And if not, she had an order from the capital's chancery to detain the bearer for questioning, and she raised a sheet of paper above her head bearing a seal in the shape of a broken chain. The crowd gasped. The judge rose to his feet. Rowan sensed the guards at the exits springing into action, and behind the crowd, horsemen in white with black chains streaming into the square from the southern street, dismounting as they rode. The capital did not wait for the performance to end. The minute between the announcement and the arrest had begun. Rowan did not use that minute to flee. He stepped onto the platform and spoke, his voice amplified not by artifice, but by years of commanding workers filling the square. He asked the judge, in the presence of all the estates, whether the court of honor recognized the right of a free farmer to test his gift before the people before the gift was attributed to the crown. Brom roared out the statute from below. The ancient right of demonstration, a gift revealed in public and recognized as useful grants its bearer the choice of service. The judge clung to the statute as if to a lifeline, for it removed the noose of capital punishment from his neck. The judge announced the demonstration. And Rowan demonstrated. He whistled, and east and west fell from the sky onto his gauntlet at once, and the crowd roared. He waved his hand, and Valun, following the gesture, lay down on the cobblestones with his full quarter metric ton weight and allowed a boy from the front row to sit on his withers. He removed Zola's collar, and the trotter passed through the crowd as if through grass, without brushing anyone, and returned. He took a log out of the sled and, with his bare hands, pulled out a comb from the glove filled with live ink bees, and the square groaned. And then Rowan did what he hadn't dared to do yesterday. He looked up at the gallery, at the silent, gray figure. The silent figure lowered his eyelids almost imperceptibly, and Roan let go of the canopy. The sacks on the sled's body soared into the air. The coal stepped onto the cobblestones, stretched its entire body, spread its wings in a 4-step sweep, and yawned, exhaling a pillar of shimmering mist. A silence fell over the square, one Tolbrook had never heard before. And then the city erupted, screams, exultation, horror. The priests made the sign of the cross in the air. The merchant's foreman stood with his mouth agape. Adela was shouting something at the judge, but no one heard her. A dragon, a living dragon, in full view of the public at the court of honor, with a farmer standing beside him, his hand resting on the dragon's crest. Roan raised his hand and the square fell silent because it wanted to listen. He said simply, "Here is his gift." He did not steal it, nor did he buy it, nor did he wrest it from anyone by force. He raised it from the dead earth where he was condemned to poverty by the gray light of the stone. With that hand, he saved 11 people from snake venom and led the Hunters Guild out of a burning swamp, and his witnesses are here. He asked the people of Tolbrook whether they considered his gift to be useful. The square's response made the platform shake. The judge hastily and almost joyfully proclaimed the gift to be genuine and useful, and the right to choose thee was vested in the bearer, according to the ancient law of public display before the 3 estates. The horseman of the white chain stood in the crowd as if in congealed honey, because to take a man for whom the entire square had just roared would mean plunging the city into rebellion, and they had no such orders. And then, stepping forward through the ranks of white cloaks, their commander emerged. An elderly, gaunt man with the face of a clerk and the eyes of an old hound. He climbed onto the platform, showed the judge the chain seal, and spoke quietly, yet in the silence that followed, the entire square could hear him. He said that the chancellery honored ancient law and congratulated the bearer on this recognition. He said that the detention was revoked, and then he turned to Rowan and added words that sent a chill down his spine. He said that the chancellery knew how to wait, and that the previous shepherd had also begun with a public display in the square. A fine start. He said that Rowan should ask his mark what had become of that shepherd and his menagerie once the beasts had grown, and the capital's patience had run out, and that the chain on their banner was unclasped, not because it was broken, but because it could always be clasped again. The commander stepped down from the platform, and the white cloaks flowed out of the square as quietly as they had entered. Idella left without saying goodbye. The crowd carried Roan on their shoulders to the inn. Digron was screaming and crying. Brom laughed into his beard. And Rowan, high above the heads of the jubilant city, looked at the deserted gallery of the Cloth Row, where just a minute ago a gray, silent figure had stood, and saw the sign left for him on the gallery railing. A knife stuck in the wood held a scrap of paper in place, and even from that distance, eyes as sharp as 20 parts could make out the 3 words scratched in charcoal. "They've taken my people." At the court of honor, Brom dismantled the tax assessment, while Adela presented the capital's arrest warrant, and a horseman in a loose black chain entered the square. Roan invoked the ancient right of presentation and staged a public display of all the beasts, including the dragon Cole, and the square recognized the gift as useful, granting him the right to choose his service, which thwarted the arrest. The commander of the White Cloaks retreated, but warned that the chancellery knew how to wait, alluding to the fate of the previous shepherd, while the silent gray figure vanished, leaving Rowan a note stating that the capital had taken his loved ones. Rowan left Tolbrook as a victor, yet he felt like a man who had been shown the edge of a very deep pit. That night at the inn, he sorted through the day's spoils. The right to choose his ministry, sealed by the court's stamp, lay in a tin tube and was worth more than all his beasts combined because it made him untouchable to the barren. The silent man's note lay nearby and was worth even more because it made him a debtor. "They took my people." 3 words from the man who had given Roan the 1 minute that saved everything. Roan sat poring over the note until the 3rd cock crow, and by dawn he had made a decision he knew would alter his entire path. He would not wait for the chain to close. He would find the white sellers before the white sellers were ready to come for him. But heading to the capital with a first-year dragon and a 4th-tier body meant handing them a gift on a platter. First, he had to grow stronger. The caravan returned to Westbrook as heroes, and the winter was spent setting up a major construction project. Roan bought the entire thorn-covered wasteland up to the ravine from the community, and his estate grew to 100 acres. Brahm and his sons built a wall of wild stone, 1.5 times a man's height, around the heart of the farm because the display in the square had made the farm famous, and fame attracts both pilgrims and thieves. Dagran brought 6 young men from the village to work as laborers, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, Rowan was once again in charge of a crew. The commands rolled off his tongue as naturally as old songs. Myrta moved into the wing by the gate because she said her vegetable garden was now there. And on the last day of winter, Roan called Garth aside for a private conversation. He laid out before the hunter a word-for-word retelling of Fess's nightly report. Garth sat as gray as ash, then spoke. The Silent One had come to him back in the fall, after the swamp, and shown him a document naming Garth as an accomplice in hiding an unaccounted-for creature that was bound for the noose. The hunter had brought ruin upon himself with that denunciation and hadn't slept a wink since. Roan listened and recalled that both Fessa and Garth had been caught in the same trap. With fear, not gold. He told Garth that he would pay for the denunciation not with a noose, but with labor, and that from now on, all of Westbrook's secret guests would be reported to Roan immediately. So the farm gained not only walls, but also ears. In the spring, it was time to raise the main crop. Coal had overwintered in the newly built stone dragon's lair, and by the time the snow melted, it was the size of a horse. The brand announced the first stage of high blood and bestowed upon its bearer 9 parts of vein strength and 6 parts of will, while Roan's breath of the horn could now knock a calf off its feet from 5 paces away. But the brand also revealed the price, a line that Roan reread 10 times. A being of high blood requires blood-based sustenance to ascend to the second stage, the fire of the earth. Roan didn't realize it right away, but once he did, he went to Brahm. The blacksmiths knew of the fire of the earth, a burning black stone from the old mines in the Grey Hills, a 4-day journey away. The mines had been abandoned during the reign of the current baron's grandfather because a creature had taken up residence deep inside, a creature the miners called the Thunderous Mother, which had devoured 3 work crews in a single summer. Since then, people had given the hills a wide berth. Roan organized the expedition like a military campaign. Himself, De Gran, Zola, Schkvael, the Falcons, and Cole, who flew above the detachment no longer in hiding because the rite of public display had made the dragon as legitimate as a plow. They entered the mine with smoke bombs and a week's worth of supplies. They found the creature on the 3rd day by sound and scent. The Thunderous Mother turned out to be a gigantic blind she-bear in her 6th molting cycle, covered in a crust of stone and driven mad by old age and darkness. Rowan chose not to fight her head-on. For 3 days, he studied its movements, its feeding trails, and its fear of drafts. On the 4th day, the squad brought down the sawed-through supports, cutting off the creature's path to the living tunnels, while Roan ordered the smoke bombs to be lit in the ventilation shaft so that the draft carried the acrid rot of alder into its lair. The creature retreated deeper into the old horizons, from which it never returned, and the mines fell to the living. The coal devoured the black rock like a foal devours oats. The dragon lay in the tunnel, right next to the seam, gnawing at the anthracite, and the veins beneath its scales glowed brighter with each passing day. Clamo kept track of the ascent, while Roan, in the meantime, used his new rights to secure, through the Tollbrook court, a 99-year lease on the abandoned mines for a pittance, and Brum wept with joy because the blacksmiths of the Grey Hills hadn't seen coal in half a century. By midsummer, 3 things happened at once. The coal reached the 2nd stage, and on the night of the ascent, a glow hung over the Grey Hills that could be seen 30 leagues away. The brand bestowed upon the bearer a series of lines that caused Roan to collapse to the ground. Physical fortitude up to 30 points. Heat resistance up to 40. The ash skin trait has been unlocked. When burned, the bearer's body hardens instead of burning. The second item arrived via the highway. Fess brought news, and the news was bad. Baron Craigmore had died suddenly of angina, and the capital had not approved an heir, so a temporary administrator from the chancellery had taken over Tollbrook, a man bearing the seal of an open chain. Idella was the first to swear allegiance to the new lord, and the Baron's menagerie passed under the capital's control along with all the inventories and denunciations. The third thing arrived during the night. Vostok removed from the leg of a carrier pigeon intercepted above the farm a tube containing a cipher, and Myrta, who was brewing potions, recognized the handwriting. The Silent One had written Roan spent the night deciphering the code. Using the key the Silent One had included in that brief note, just 3 words, and having cracked it, sat motionless for an hour. The Silent One was writing from the capital. His loved ones were being held in the white cellars of the Office of Gift Investigation, in the quarter beyond the river gates. He was not writing about them. He wrote that the office had finished sorting through the previous shepherd's archives and had found the most important thing there. The shepherd's mark is not born within a person. The mark is passed on. Before his death, the former bearer had managed to send the mark away from the capital by hiding it inside an object, and the office had been searching for that object for 20 years throughout all the provinces. Mulchin wrote that they now know where it has found a new owner, Dadov's estate near the Thorny Wasteland. And the last line revealed the reason the dove had flown halfway across the country. In the fall, the Chancellery will declare a livestock plague throughout the lands. A false one. Under the pretext of the plague, emergency service convoys will set out with the right to confiscate and burn any livestock without trial, and Westbrook is first on the list of farms. The right of public display protects the bearer. It does not protect the animals. Roan fortified the farm with a wall, hired workers, made Garth his eyes and ears, and leased the cop of the Grey Hills, bringing the thunderous mother from there to feed Cole with the fire of the earth. The dragon reached the second stage, granting Roan 30 points of fortitude, 40 points of heat resistance, and the ash skin trait, while the Baron died and Tollbrook became the steward of the Chancellery with Idella in his service. A decryption by the Silent One from the capital revealed that the shepherd's brand is passed down through an heirloom from grandfather to grandson, that the Chancellery had been searching for it for 20 years, and that in the fall, under the pretext of a false livestock plague, emergency service convoys would set out to burn livestock without trial, with Westbrook first on the list. Roan read the letter to the secret task force, which now included Degran, Murda, Brom, and Garth, and said they had the summer to make the seizure impossible. There's no way to fend it off. You can't fend off the capital. Making it impossible is like trying to prevent the seizure of a river or the wind. He laid out the plan in his notebook in 3 columns and titled them Disperse, Legalize, and Arm. Disperse meant that the farm would no longer be a single compound that could be surrounded and burned. Over the summer, Roan leased out half of his livestock to households in Westbrook and 3 neighboring villages. Each farmstead received a pair of mature rabbits or a colony in a hutch under a contract that included a share of the offspring. And to Roan's amazement, the living boundary stretched out in all directions with thin threads to reach the animals, because the brand considered everything it had raised with its own hands to be under its protection, no matter where it was located. By fall, the shepherd's animals were living in 200 farmsteads within a rock leagues around, and to seize them meant going to war with the entire region. To legalize it meant a document stronger than paper itself. Brom and a solicitor hired in Tollbrook unearthed a century-old provision in the statutes. The right of presentation granted a choice of service, and Roan made his choice. He submitted a petition to have the derelict farm recognized as a tribal estate of the crown, with the delivery of improved livestock to the treasury. The calculation was cold and calculated. The Office of Inquiry and the capital's treasury were different beasts altogether and were fighting over the trough. Upon receiving the first shipment of rabbits from the tribal estate, which delighted the army quartermasters, the treasury stood firmly behind the farm because the estate generated revenue for the treasury, while the Office of Inquiry was nothing but an expense. In the fall, a letter bearing the royal seal arrived, and the word crown on the farm's gates carried more weight than a chain. To arm meant something Roan had kept silent about, even to his brigade until the very end. He needed a beast for a war that could not be won by force. The war was being waged for the Silent One's people and against the Sellers, and you don't enter the Sellers with a dragon. You enter the Sellers as a shadow. Roan returned to the Night Whisperer and to Myrta's notes, and found in them a mention that the Whisperers gather once every 7 years at the Capercaillie Marsh to raise their chicks. He sat out 2 weeks in that marsh under the canopy, brought out 3 chicks, hand-fed them, and by fall was raising 4 owls. The brand had fulfilled its share. Willpower was at 19 parts, and the quiet canopy ceased to be a canopy and became a cloak. Roan now covered himself and his 2 companions, and could walk like that through the market crowd, and the crowd flowed around the empty space. The emergency service convoys arrived in late fall, just as the Silent One had written. 12 wagons with cages, men in waxed cloaks with crimson sashes, and a document regarding the livestock signed by the steward. It was not Roan who met them at the bridge across the Ledyanka. They were met by Hubart, the elected village headman from the 4 villages, bearing a document from the Crown Estate, and with him a clerk who read aloud the provision stating that livestock from the state tribal registry may be seized only by order of the treasury. And behind the delegation on the hill stood silently 300 men from 200 households, who now had their own share in the shepherd's beasts. The head of the convoy read the decree at length. Then he looked toward the hill. Then he ordered the wagons to turn around. The capital had received a report stating that confiscation in the Midnight Lands was impossible without military reinforcements, and no general would sign off on military reinforcements against the Crown's tribal court. Roan learned of the report a week later from the Silent One's second coded message, and that same message contained bitter news. The Chancellery is changing its plan. Since the beasts cannot be taken, the Secret Service will come for the messenger personally this winter, without paperwork and without witnesses, because the failed governor of Tollbrook has staked his head on it. And a postscript at the end: his loved ones were being transferred from the cellars to a distant fortress by the end of the month, and once the transfer was complete, he would never find them again. Roan folded the letter and realized that summer was over in every sense. Waiting for the Secret Service in Westbrook meant exposing everyone sleeping within his walls to the knives of the night. To go out to meet them meant choosing the battlefield himself. He chose the latter in a single evening, and the brigade saw him like this for the first time. He left the farm on Degran and Myrta under the protection of the Crown's charter, which now defended the court better than the walls. He took Zola, 2 owls, and Shkval with him. Ugol received an order that the dragon did not like: to travel at night along the flight path home, but not to show himself over the capital, because a dragon over the capital meant war. And Rowan also took with him a man whom the brigade had unanimously refused to accept: Garth. He told them what he thought. A traitor who had betrayed out of fear and been brought to the light walks more cautiously than a saint, and a hunter's eyes and his bow would not be out of place in a foreign city. They traveled south for 18 days. For the first time, Rowan saw the country to which his new body belonged by birth. The roads were clogged with caravans, small towns where altar stones no longer stood in the squares, but inside temples for a price. Burned-out villages near the borders of old wars, and everywhere he heard the same name whispered: the Office of Gift Investigation. People simply called it the Chain. The Chain registered gifted children from birth. The Chain took the strong into its service and the rebellious into its basements. And at every tavern there was a man who knew someone who had been taken away. The capital rose on the horizon on the 19th day, a sea of smoke and spires, and it was larger than Roan could have imagined in either of his lifetimes. No one was looking for him at the river gate because the Secret Service that had followed him north had missed him on the roads, just as he'd calculated, having spread the rumor through Fess that the farmer was spending the winter at home in the city. Roan rented a corner of the cattle yard where his beasts wouldn't attract attention, and for 3 nights he walked under the canopy of his cloak around the government quarter, counting the guards at the windows and the drains. The quarter was a fortress. But every fortress has something that Roan knew better than fortifications. A fortress has a livestock yard. A chain secured the dungeons beneath the cellars, where a menagerie of captured creatures was kept, and this menagerie was fed twice a week by carters from the livestock yard. On the fourth night, in a fodder cart entering the rear gate of the compound, two figures lay beneath sacks of oats, covered by a canopy cloak, and an owl sat between them, while a second owl watched the cart from above through Roan's eyes. The gate creaked. The cart came to a stop, and the brand beneath Roan's collarbone flared up so intensely that he bit down on his sleeve. The brand was screaming. Deep below, beneath the stone courtyard, it sensed dozens of creatures in a state of decline, and among them was one toward which the brand was drawn like a magnet, a creature of the highest bloodline, ancient, enormous, and nearly extinguished. Over the summer, Roan had scattered the beasts across 200 courtyards, achieved the status of a crown tribal courtyard, and failed the autumn conscription by the emergency service. Meanwhile, the four owls had raised his willpower to 19 units and transformed the canopy into a cloak for 3. The silent cipher warned that in winter the Secret Service would come for Roan without any paperwork and that the Silent One's loved ones would be transferred to a distant fortress. Therefore, Roan himself left for the capital with Zola, the owls, Shkval, and Garth, leaving the farm under the Crown's charter and leading Ogle secretly at a distance. After sneaking into a fodder wagon in the backyard of the Chains Quarter, Roan sensed, through the brand, dozens of fading creatures in the cellars, and among them an ancient being of the highest bloodline on the brink of death. The wagon pulled up next to the feed barn, and the driver went to wake the receiver. Roan and Garth slipped out from under the sacks into the shadow between the woodpile and the wall, and the canopy of their cloaks closed over them. From there, Roan proceeded as he always did, first reconnaissance, then action. For 2 nights in a row, he went in with carts full of fodder and came out with empty ones, and by the 3rd night he knew the office's backyard like the back of his hand. The menagerie of confiscated creatures occupied a long cellar beneath the north wing. Below that lay a second level where the foragers never ventured, and from which came a chill and that fading sensation that made the brand ache. Even lower, if one was to believe the heating pipes and the count of steps from the audible footsteps of the guards, lay the 3rd level, and Roan, with his hearing divided into 15 parts, would catch human voices coming from there at night. Not many. About 15. Contrary to their terrifying reputation, the chain's cellars were not overcrowded, and that was the most terrifying part, because it meant that most of those taken from here neither left nor lingered. The Silent One had to search for people on the 3rd horizon, and search quickly because the transfer to the fortress was scheduled for the new moon, and there were 6 nights left until the new moon. On the 4th night, Roan descended to the 2nd horizon. The locks on the chains were opened with keys, and the keys were carried by the menagerie keeper, a drunkard with the eyes of a fat pig, and Roan's owl perched on the ledge of his cubbyhole all evening, while the keeper got drunk and the curtain allowed her to remove the bundle from the nail right next to his head. The 2nd horizon turned out to be exactly what Roan had suspected, and what, until the very last moment, refused to believe. Along the walls stood not cages, but machines. The creatures in the machines were immobilized by straps, and from each of them stretched glass veins toward copper cauldrons, along which a dim glow dripped. The chain did not hold the captured beasts. The chain milked them. It squeezed out, bit by bit, the very thing that the shepherd's brand bestowed upon its bearer as a gift and through labor. Roan walked along the machines, and the brand burned him like a red-hot coin. 6th molt wolfhounds. A blind griffin with clipped flight feathers, a pair of marsh whisperers at the sight of which his own owl on his shoulder clung tightly to his neck. And at the end of the passage, behind a separate grill, lay what the brand had been drawing him toward since the 1st night. In a pit 20 paces across lay a female dragon, curled up, old, white with age like the ash of a burnt-out fire. Her wings were pierced with rings fastened to the floor, Copper taps were embedded in her scales along her spine, and wires as thick as a hand ran from the taps to cauldrons. She was not asleep. She turned her head and looked at Roan with eyes in which no fire remained, only a very old and very patient longing. The brand scrolled through the lines slowly, as if it could not believe what it was seeing. A creature of the highest bloodline, an ash dragoness, 7th stage before extraction status, 20 years of draining. The fading is nearing completion. Custody is possible only upon full release. And below that, another line that made Roan's breath catch. Kinship detected. The creature is the progenitor of the Cole lineage. Roan stood by the bars as the pieces came together into picture. A fire-blooded serpent in the swamp near Westbrook with a clutch of 9 eggs, 8 of which were empty and 1 alive. An ash dragon hatched from an egg in a region where dragons hadn't been seen for generations. Cole's mother was no ordinary creature. She was the last daughter of this very white captive who had once fled from Siam to the wild north and carried her blood to the marshes. For 20 years, the chain had drained the grandmother, and for 20 years it had searched the land for her granddaughter's blood and a brand capable of nurturing it. It all came down to one farmer. Roan returned to the city before dawn and spent the day poring over a plan that was no longer just a plan to extract 15 people. He couldn't bring the people out and leave her in the pit. The brand wouldn't allow it, and neither would the man Roan had been before the brand. But a 7th-tier white dragoness, even a dormant one, couldn't pass through the corridors. There was only one way to let her out, up through the vaults, and the vaults could only be broken by dragon fire, and fire over the capital meant exactly what Roan had vowed to himself he would never allow. He sent Vostok north with a note for Ugol, consisting of a single word, closer. And that very night, the Silent One came to Roan's inn. The former shepherd sat down at the table and said he'd sensed Roan's beasts in the city for 3 days now, and that since the farmer was here, they needed to speak plainly. He laid out on the table what Roan didn't know. On the new moon, the head of the chancellery himself would arrive in the chain quarter to take stock of 20 years of work. This final assessment was called the last extraction. The dragoness would be drained dry in a single night because her life force had run out and keeping her any longer was too costly. They'll use the energy harvested to power what the chain had been building all these years in the West Wing, the branding furnace, a device capable of burning and implanting the marks of gifts chosen by the Chancellery. The chain no longer wanted to hunt down the gifted throughout the country. The chain wanted to create them itself and make them obedient. The Silent One said that his loved ones were being transferred on the same new moon by the same convoy because the head liked to transport everything at once. And looking down at the table, he added that he didn't dare ask the farmer to go against the head of the Chancellery, but he couldn't not ask. Roan was silent for a long time. Then he asked how many guards there would be on the new moon. Mulchin replied that there would be 3 times as many as usual. Rowan nodded and said that was good. Mulchin looked up. Rowan explained calmly, just as he would explain haymaking duties to his workers. 3 times the usual number of guards meant that all the keys, all the supervisors, and all the locked doors would be gathered in one place on a single night. The chain itself had gathered everything he was looking for into a single basket. People, the dragoness, horn, and the serpent's head. All that remained was to assign the tasks. He pulled the sheet of paper closer and began writing columns. Mulchin watched the farmer writing, and for the first time in 20 years, something resembled a hope. And 3 days' flight north of the capital in the remote Koshik Mountains. Ugol rose from his resting place, spread his wings, which over the fall had grown wider than a sleigh train, and headed south, flying low over the forests. And wherever he passed, the night birds fell silent, and the wolves lifted their muzzles to see him off him with a long howl, just as one bids farewell to a thunderstorm. Roan scouted the chain quarter and found on the second horizon the machines where, for 20 years, the gifts had been extracted from the captured beings, and in a pit, a white, ashen 7th-tier dragoness, the progenitor of Ugol's line, nearly extinguished. The Silent One discovered that, On the new moon, the head of the chancellery would carry out the final extraction until nothing remained to charge the branding furnace for the mass creation of obedient, gifted beings, and that his loved ones would be taken away by the same convoy. Roan decided to free the people in a single night, destroy the dragoness, and destroy the furnace, using the gathering of all the guards and officials as an opportunity, while Cole, summoned by a note, heads south toward the capital. The new moon arrived with low-hanging clouds, and Roan considered this his first stroke of luck, because the darkness worked in favor of the canopy and the clouds worked against the dragon. He divided the tasks among the 4 of them and all the beasts, and each knew their assigned section by heart. Garth, with his bow, and Zepad took up positions on the bell tower of the cloth row, from where they could shoot across the backyard. The Silent One drove the fodder cart because his detector badge opened the gates without question. Squall waited in the alley by the river gates, harnessed to a light sleigh for people who wouldn't be able to run. And Roan, with Zola and the 2 owls, entered the cart under the canopy's cloak, and from there began the work that cannot be described because it consisted entirely of ifs. At midnight, carriages rolled into the quarter. Roan, lying beneath the sacks, listened to the gates creak and counted the guards by their footsteps. The head of the chancellery arrived with a small retinue and descended to the second horizon at once. They began without delay. Roan let them start because the extraction process required opening all the valves and cutting the wires, which meant that the chain itself was removing half the locks from the dragoness. He waited the time needed to fill the cauldron, a quarter full, and went down through the supply hatch with the caretaker's keys. They took the 3rd level quietly. 2 guards at the human cells stared into the void until the void was behind them, and Zola and Roan took them both down without spilling a drop of blood. 15 people, gray from the lack of light, rose from their bunks in the cells, and among them were a woman and a boy, whom Roan recognized before the Silent One could describe them, because the boy was looking at him with the same eyes as an old dog. Roan led everyone up through the supply hatch, handed them over to the Silent One in the cart, and the cart made its way to the gate in the usual manner, with the censor's badge and a canopy made from one of the owls covering the people on top of the sacks. The first half of the job was done and checked off the list. The second half began with a shout from below. The extraction wasn't going as planned. As Roan made his way back down, he heard voices arguing in the machine shop, and the leading voice, dry and even, ordered the main valves to be opened all the way because the vein was empty and deadlines wouldn't wait. The dragoness screamed. She didn't roar, she screamed, and at that scream, Roan's brand cramped up as if his hand were seizing. He stepped out of the shadows into the forge and lifted the canopy. What followed unfolded in 50 heartbeats, each of which Roan later remembered individually. The guards by the cauldrons turned around. The horn's breath struck down the first 3 with a wave of scorching heat. Ash swept through the hall like a gray death, knocking crossbows from their hands. Roan tore the spine-like valves from the scales with his bare hands, and his ashen skin withstood the spatter of boiling light that even steel could not endure. A gaunt man in black by the far wall raised his hand, and his own gift, the word of shackles, shattered from his palm, for the head of the chain was himself one of the gifted. The air around Roan froze with shackles. And then Don and his own gift slips from his palm, for the head of the chain was himself among the gifted, and his gift was the word of shackles. The air around Roan freezes into shackles. And then what Roan had been cultivating for a year without knowing why came into play. The will of 19 parts of 4 owls bends under the word, but does not break, and the dragoness, raising her head from the pit, looks at the head of the chancellery with the gaze of a 7th-tier creature, and the word of shackles snaps like a rotten rope, because one cannot shackle the will of one who has not gone mad for 20 years only by will. The head retreated toward the staircase and summoned the guards of the upper posts. And then, above the chain quarter, the sky split open. Coal plunged through the clouds and struck with its heat. Not the people, but the ridge of the western wing's roof, exactly where Rowan had ordered it to strike, according to the blueprint drawn in charcoal on birch bark. The wing where the branding furnace stood collapsed in on itself in a pillar of flame, and the coppery rumble of the bursting seal could be heard across the river. The guards at the upper posts set about fighting the fire, for a fire in the capital is more terrifying than any enemy. And in the forge hall, Roan unchained the dragoness's last wing and spoke a single word to her. Up, she couldn't fly. She crawled along the collapsed ramp that Ugol had smashed through with his second blow, straight toward the pit, and the grandson offered his back to his grandmother, carrying her, half dragging, half carrying, through the burning wing into the night. Roan was the last to leave the fodder yard, carrying the menagerie keeper, who had been wounded by a crossbow bolt on his shoulder, because the same thing that wouldn't let him leave the dragoness behind wouldn't let him leave the drunkard to burn. The head of the chancellery was waiting for him at the gate, alone, without guards. A gaunt man stood in his path and did not raise his hands. He said he recognized the handwriting. The previous shepherd had also set fires and also saved lives, and ended up with his beasts lying down for him, every last one of them, while the brand went off in search of a new fool. He said that the chain had survived fires before and would survive this one, but whether the village courtyard in the Midnight Lands would survive the winter when not the emergency services but the army, under the pretext of a rebellion, would arrive, would be decided right now by Roan's next moves. Roan listened, and the brand burned him with rage, but beneath that rage, the calculations he'd learned from both of his lives were at work. He replied calmly. He said that half the city had seen the army near the capital today, because you can't hide a dragon in the sky, and tomorrow the capital would know that the chain had brought things to the point where dragons were burning it in the middle of the world. He said that 15 witnesses from the guild halls were riding in his sleigh, and among them were people whose families held greater standing than the chancellery. He said that the crown's tribal court feeds the treasury, and the treasury will hold accountable anyone who touches the court. And finally, he placed a tin tube containing a scroll on the snow between them, a copy of the inventory of the Second Horizon, which he had compiled over 3 nights. The names of the captured creatures, the dates, the warden's signatures. Roan said there were 6 such copies held by 6 different people, and if anything happened to Westbrook or the Silent Ones, the inventories would land on the king's desk and those of all the heads of the estates at once. And then he walked past the head of the chancellery toward the gate, and the head did not stop him because the scales had tipped against the chain, and both of them knew it. Outside the city, by the river gate, a sleigh was waiting. The Silent One stood nearby, embracing a woman with one arm and a boy with the other, and when Roan approached, the former shepherd said nothing, but simply removed his hat. Ugol, with the dragoness on his back, headed north first, and the clouds closed in behind them. The convoy set off into the snowstorm, which covered their tracks better than any canopy, and at dawn, smoke still hung over the capital behind them, and Roan, glancing back at it just once, never looked back again. On the night of the new moon, Roan led a nighttime assault on the Chains Quarter, rescued 15 prisoners, including the Silent One's family, and freed the White Dragoness by tearing down the final restraint, while Cole destroyed the branding furnace and carried the matriarch away on his back. The head of the chancellery tried to stop Roan by threatening to send the army against Westbrook, but Roan presented 6 copies of the inventories of the machine shops held by various custodians, witnesses from noble families, and the backing of the treasury, and the head of the chancellery backed down. The convoy carrying the rescued people headed north into a snowstorm. Cole and the dragoness flew ahead, while smoke from the burned-down west wing lingered over the capital. The journey home was long, taking a roundabout route through the eastern highways, and they entered Westbrook in the middle of winter toward evening, when plumes of smoke from the stoves rose above the village. Roan expected anything but what he saw. Torches were burning at the farm gate, the entire village had gathered there, and boys were perched on the wall like sparrows. Daegrin sent the falcons to meet them a day earlier, having spotted the convoy from the east, and Westbrook welcomed its own. Myrta was crying and cursing at the same time. Brahm shook the hand of the silent man he was seeing for the first time so hard that the man winced. The 15 survivors were sent to different houses to warm up, and Hubert personally assigned their lodgings with the air of a commander. As for Rowan, his first stop was not a house, but the wasteland beyond the ravine. Where the brand had pointed there, on a thawed patch of ground amid the snow, lay a white dragoness, and Cole lay beside her, wing to wing, warming her with his heat. The brand confirmed what Rowan had already sensed himself. The decline has been halted. Recovery is possible. It will take years. Rowan sat down beside her in the snow, and the dragoness rested her head so that her breath ruffled his hair. He sat there until the stars came out. Spring came early, bringing news with it. Fess brought rumors from the capital. The head of the Inquisition office had been replaced, and the Inquisition itself had been placed under the Crown's direct authority by special decree, and its budget slashed by 2/3 because someone had placed certain documents on the right desks and had them confirmed by certain witnesses. The decree said nothing about the dragon over the capital, but the city told its legends. The chain had not died, but it had broken. And in this world, where Rowan was to continue living, this was more than a victory. It was a change in the weather. By summer, the old thorn-covered wasteland was unrecognizable. The Crown's tribal estate had grown into a farmstead, to which Rowan finally gave a name, painting it on the gate, the protected boundaries. Within the walls, 20 species lived and thrived. The heather rabbits, which had spread throughout the estates of the two baronies, were quietly and irrevocably changing peasant life, for meat was no longer a treat reserved for special occasions. The granite oxen from Walloon plowed the fields for 3 men. Myrta, along with 2 apprentices, distilled the honey from the ink-black bees into medicines that merchants were already shipping overseas. The Silent One, whose real name turned out to be Severin, remained at the boundaries as a caretaker, and his intuition tracked down creatures on the verge of extinction across the land before the hunters could find them. His boy followed Rowan around like a shadow, and the boy's eyes were no longer those of a dog, but of a young boy. Gart, having served his sentence on the road to the capital, received a handshake from Rowan in front of everyone, and with that handshake, the past was cut clean off. Degran had learned to read and write from the steward, and now kept half the records, because there were now 11 ledgers. And in the fall, a letter bearing the royal seal arrived, and Rowan read it aloud at the Mej Council. The crown offered the bearer of the shepherd's gift the position of overseer of all the tribal estates in the kingdom, with a move to the capital, along with a rank and authority. The council looked at Rowan and waited. Rowan folded the letter and dictated a reply to Digran, in which he expressed his gratitude and declined, because his gift grew from this land, and if transplanted to the capital's pot, it would wither. Instead, he offered the crown something else. Once a year, the sacred boundaries would accept 10 apprentices from any land, whoever the communities sent, not the gifted ones, ordinary ones, because over the course of 2 lifetimes, he had come to understand one thing worth more than all the shares and parts combined. The beast does not bestow its power upon the brand. The beast bestows its power upon the hands that raised it and the patience that nurtured it, while the brand merely keeps an honest tally. This means that anyone willing to work can be trained. The crown liked the answer, and in the following spring, the first 10 teenagers stood at the gates of Mez with their knapsacks, among them a girl with the gray light of a stone over her fate, whom the community had sent with a malicious intent of getting rid of her. But when Rowan saw the gray light, he laughed for the first time, startling his students, and took her first. Another year later, the white dragoness took flight. She rose from the wasteland with difficulty and didn't go far, but she rose nonetheless, and the entire village poured out to watch as 2 ashen silhouettes, one large and one smaller, circled above the river in the sunset sky. That evening, the mark revealed to Rowan lines he had never seen before. Guardianship is deemed complete for a 7th-tier creature of the highest bloodline. The creature is free. No share is to be collected. The bearer is to receive not a share, but gratitude. Immediately afterward, a warm wave coursed through Rowan's body, causing all the count columns of the mark to merge into one, and the mark simply stated that the bearer's limit had been lifted. Rowan stood on the boundary, looking up and realized that the dragoness was free to fly wherever she wished. She circled above the second and third boundaries. Then she descended back to her patch of open ground next to Cole, because freedom isn't when you have nowhere to return to, but when you return of your own free will. That same fall, Roan finished the last task from his old notebook. He climbed into the attic of his grandfather's house, sorted through the chest, the one where it all began, relying on his memory of the brand marks, and found at the bottom, beneath the dust, a canvas bundle that he had mistaken for rags a year and a half earlier. Inside the bundle lay a shepherd's flute made of dark dead wood, warm to the touch, as if alive. An object into which the former shepherd had imprinted a mark when sending it away from the chain. An object that had chosen an orphan dying from a fall because, even after crashing to the ground, the orphan had crawled not toward the village for help, but toward the house to check if his grandfather's goat had been fed. Roan held the flute in his hands for a long time. Then he decided neither to hide it nor to burn it. He placed it in a prominent spot on a shelf in the schoolhouse where his 10 students studied, and told them that it was a memento of a man he had never known, but to whom he owed everything. "Let it lie out in the open," he said. "What people seek in cellars, they hide in cellars. What is raised in the open is kept in the light." One winter evening, toward the end of that year, Roan went out on his rounds as usual. The snow crunched beneath his feet. Inside the dragon's lair, 2 dragons sighed in their sleep. In the warm barn, Valen chewed hay, and Zola, her muzzle now completely gray, slept by his side because old animals keep each other warm. A squall chased moonlit shadows across the wasteland, simply for the joy of running. Owls called to one another over the rooftops. In the village beyond the ravine, windows glowed, and in every other house lived some creature he had raised. Roan stopped in the middle of the yard and listened to all this commotion at once, with the hearing of beasts, the keen eyesight of birds, and the patience of the earth. Once he had died in the midst of the work he loved. Then he woke up a penniless orphan with a gray light above his head, in a world where strength was measured by killing. And it turned out that here, as everywhere else, the same simple rule applied, one he had known throughout his first life and proven in his second. It doesn't matter what you were given at birth, a stone, the gods, or chance. What matters is what you've made of what you were given. Roan adjusted the pole on the gate, checked the latch on the dragon gate out of habit, a habit no power could undo, and walked toward the house where a lamp was burning. Tomorrow there would be much work to do, as always, just as it should be. Roan returned home. The chain had been broken by decree of the crown. The rescued and Severin's family had found a home, and the sacred boundaries had become a tribal court that was transforming the lives of the entire region. Roan declined a position in the capital, instead opening a school for ordinary students, including the girl with the gray light, while the white dragoness was healed, gained her freedom, and remained of her own free will, having removed the carrier's restriction. Having found the flute of the former shepherd through which the mark had been passed on, Roan placed it in the light within the schoolhouse, and the story concluded with his evening rounds, leading him to the conclusion that what matters is not what is given at birth, but what you have cultivated from what you were given.